Welcome to Midnight Murmurs, your gateway to soothing mysteries and chilling whispers. I'm here to help you unwind and explore captivating tales that lurk in the shadows. Remember to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing where and when you're listening. Now, relax and let the night embrace you. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. In fact, I prided myself on being as rational and methodical as any man could be, qualities that had served me well during my years at St. Aurelia's Hospital. Night after night, I performed my duties in the quiet sterility of the morgue, my mind focused solely on the tasks at hand. Until tonight, everything was supposed to follow the same predictable pattern. The clock in the break room ticked past midnight as I arrived for my shift, my breath forming small, misty clouds in the air of the chilled corridor. I took a deep, steadying breath. I'd long since come to love the predictable cadence of my routine, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the muted echoes of footsteps along the tiled floors, and the sterile scent of antiseptics mingled with a hint of something more permanent. As I unlocked the heavy door to the morgue, the cool, clinical air enveloped me. I let the familiar shiver crawl up my spine, a reminder that I was in the realm of death, where every detail mattered. I began by inspecting the refrigeration units. Their digital displays glowed faintly, and each compartment was methodically organized. My hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. I paused for a moment at the far end of the room, where a single body lay in repose on a stainless steel table. I scrutinized every detail, the positioning of the arms, the subtle contours of the face, as if I were reading a story written in silent testimony. My focus was absolute. Yet, as I checked the routine logs, a peculiar unease began to burrow into the edges of my mind. At precisely 12:15, the overhead lights flickered. I frowned, expecting a minor technical hiccup. The brightness dimmed for a second before snapping back to full intensity. The chill that accompanied the brief blackout was inexplicable, even in a room designed to keep everything frigid. I paused, an almost imperceptible tremor in my hand, but I quickly chided myself for letting my imagination run away with me. It was just a faulty light, nothing more. Later in the shift, as I methodically catalogued the day's arrivals, I heard a soft murmur echo in the corridors outside. I told myself it was nothing more than the hum of the building settling, or perhaps a trick of the acoustics. Still, a faint whisper seemed to drift right by my ear, a hushed, almost inaudible tone that suggested someone was murmuring secrets in the darkness. I brushed it off as a fragment of my tired mind playing tricks on me. At around 1 a.m., as I began my rounds, I encountered Marcus in the adjoining storage room. Marcus, a rugged but friendly soul, always had a knack for finding conversation in the dead of night. He leaned casually against a metal cabinet, his eyes reflecting both curiosity and concern. "You notice anything odd lately?" he asked in a low tone, his voice barely above a whisper. His question, laced with the unmistakable timbre of recent hospital gossip, unsettled me slightly. I'd heard murmurs about inexplicable events, but I never imagined I'd feel the chill of these rumors firsthand. "Odd?" I echoed, my voice steady despite the knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. "Just the usual wear and tear of a building this old. Lights flicker, pipes groan. Nothing to worry about." I forced a laugh, trying to banish the creeping disquiet. Marcus frowned, as if unsatisfied with my nonchalant dismissal. "They say something's not right in the morgue these days. Some folks even claim to hear whispers, voices that don't belong." His eyes, though wry, hinted at a deeper unease. "Maybe it's just stress, or perhaps the building's settling, but still, "There's something off." I nodded, pretending to share in his amusement, though inwardly, every word he uttered echoed in the hollow recesses of my mind. Perhaps it was the fatigue from another long night or the cumulative effect of staring into the silent faces of those who'd passed on. I dismissed his words as mere exaggeration, the product of overactive imaginations in a place designed to evoke discomfort. Returning to my station, I resumed my meticulous documentation. The steady hum of the refrigeration units served as a comforting background noise, lulling me back into the rhythm of my work. But then it happened again, the subtle whispering. This time, I was alone. I paused mid-sentence as the faint murmur slithered through the stillness of the morgue. I strained my ears, my heart inexplicably quickening its beat. The sound was soft, like the rustle of leaves in a windless night, but it carried an eerie urgency. For a few long seconds, the whispering persisted, a susurration that seemed to emanate from behind the rows of drawers and metal containers. I turned slowly, scanning the room with an intensity that belied my outward calm. There was no one there. The shadows clung to the corners, undisturbed and silent, but the impression of a presence lingered, as if the room itself was hiding a secret too terrible to be voiced. I felt a chill ripple through my body, sharper and more invasive than any physical cold. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, a side effect of too many late hours in a place steeped in death. Yet, as the whispers faded, replaced by the mundane beeping of the monitors, I couldn't entirely dismiss the sensation. Every rational thought in me insisted that it was merely the acoustics of an old building, but a small, irrational voice whispered otherwise. I scribbled a quick note in my log, unexplained auditory anomaly. Likely fatigue. I resumed my tasks with a mounting sense of trepidation. The morgue, usually a bastion of order and routine, now seemed infused with an undercurrent of the unknown. My rational mind battled with an unbidden feeling of dread that something, someone, was lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. Each time the lights flickered, a chill surged through me, and every creak of the building set my nerves on edge. While I methodically prepared the body for the next scheduled examination, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. My gloved hand trembled slightly as I adjusted the cover over the body. The stillness was oppressive, the silence punctuated by that elusive murmur that I had dismissed earlier as mere fatigue. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice what it had been trying to tell me all along. I moved toward the exit of the morgue, my steps echoing in the cavernous space. As I passed by the rows of cold storage units, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the polished metal surfaces, a face drawn and pale, eyes wide with a barely concealed panic. I tried to convince myself that it was only the interplay of dim lights and flickering shadows, but deep down, I feared that something darker was at work. The night wore on, each minute stretching out into an eternity of quiet dread. I found myself counting the seconds, the minutes marked by the intermittent flicker of overhead bulbs and the almost rhythmic pulse of that distant, inexplicable whisper. By the time I finally ended my shift, my mind was awash with conflicting thoughts, a blend of rationality and a creeping, irrational terror that I dared not name. Before leaving, I caught a final glimpse of Marcus in the distant corridor, his face partially illuminated by the harsh glow of a hallway light. His expression was somber, almost as if he had been witnessing the same subtle disturbances that I had tried so hard to ignore. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the unsaid fears that lurked in the shadows of St. Aurelius. As I locked the morgue door behind me and stepped out into the chilly night air, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. My nightly routine, once a bastion of order in an otherwise chaotic world, had been interrupted by forces beyond explanation. The rational part of me, the meticulous, empirical Daniel, insisted that there was a logical explanation, a fault in the wiring, a trick of acoustics, perhaps even my own fatigued mind playing tricks. Yet, a seed of doubt had been planted, one that would grow with each subsequent shift. That night, as I trudged home under the dim glow of streetlights and the distant hum of the city, I couldn't escape the sensation of being followed by unseen eyes. Every rustle of wind in the trees, every creak of an old sign, seemed to echo with a quiet warning. I told myself that I was simply tired, that the mind can conjure terrors when sleep is scarce and shadows loom large. But deep inside, I knew that the ordinary had been infiltrated by the extraordinary, and perhaps, by something utterly inexplicable. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of my modest apartment, the events of the night swirl in my thoughts. I try to convince myself that it was all just the mundane interplay of an old building and a weary mind. But the whispering, the flickering lights, and the inexplicable chill continue to haunt me, echoing through my every thought like a persistent refrain. I can only hope that the coming nights will restore the balance between reason and the unknown. Yet, a nagging fear tells me that the routine I once relied on has been forever altered. And so, with the weight of the unseen pressing upon my mind, I find myself questioning whether the comforting regularity of my work might have masked a dark truth, a truth that was beginning to reveal itself, one whispered secret at a time. The morning after that unnerving night, I awoke to a stubborn haze of fatigue and a disquieting feeling that clung to my skin like a second, unwanted layer. The memory of flickering lights and those elusive whispers haunted my dreams, leaving behind an intangible residue of dread. I tried to shake it off as I prepared for another night at St. Aurelia's Hospital, but even in the relative brightness of dawn, a persistent chill reminded me that something was amiss. Walking to the bus stop, I found myself glancing repeatedly over my shoulder. Every passerby, every shifting shadow, seemed to hold a secret. The crisp morning air carried the scent of dew and an undercurrent of decay, a juxtaposition that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I told myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind, yet deep down I couldn't escape the nagging notion that the boundary between the mundane and the inexplicable was beginning to blur. By the time my shift started, the hospital corridors were already steeped in a hushed, anticipatory calm. The sterile walls, usually a canvas of predictable routine, now appeared subtly altered, as if touched by a hand that had moved objects ever so slightly out of place. As I entered the morgue, I couldn't help but notice that the orderly arrangement I had meticulously maintained the night before had a few inconsistencies. A tray that I distinctly remembered setting in one corner now rested a few inches away, and a medical chart lay slightly askew on a metal table where it had always been perfectly aligned. My logical mind argued that these were trivial oversights, a product of my own tiredness, but an unease, impossible to rationalize, began to mount. During my first round of the evening, while methodically checking each refrigerated compartment, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadow, a dark, almost indistinguishable shape flitting across the periphery of my vision. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. For a long, suspended moment, I strained to see it clearly, yet whenever I turned my head directly, it evaporated into the gloom. I chided myself, "It's just your imagination, Daniel. Nothing is really there." And yet, the feeling of being watched lingered like an unwanted specter. Later, as the night deepened and the hospital seemed to cocoon itself in an almost palpable silence, the strangest of all disturbances made itself known. While reviewing the morgue paperwork, a series of logs, checklists, and case files, I discovered markings that hadn't been there before. They were faint, almost like scratches etched by an invisible hand, obscured beneath the routine scrawls of my daily notes. The symbols were archaic in style, the lines twisting into shapes that defied immediate interpretation. I leaned in, adjusting my glasses, trying to decipher any meaning hidden within their cryptic patterns. But each attempt only deepened the mystery, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Was it a sign of tampering, or perhaps the echo of something from the hospital's distant past? As the evening progressed, the anomalies multiplied. The quiet hum of the refrigeration units seemed to carry a new, dissonant rhythm, a low, almost imperceptible droning that resonated in the hollow corners of the room. I began to pick up on subtle shifts, a metal stool slightly displaced, the reflection in a polished surface that hinted at a presence behind me. I moved about the space with the heightened awareness of someone who knew that every detail mattered, yet nothing seemed out of place when I looked directly. The sensation was maddening, a constant tug at the edge of my perception, making me doubt the solidity of the reality I'd always trusted. It wasn't long before I found myself sharing these concerns with someone who had always been a beacon of calm amidst the chaos of my nightly routine. Lisa, a longtime friend and confidant, had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when I was under duress. We had met years ago through a shared interest in quiet midnight coffees and deep, existential conversations. When I finally picked up her phone that afternoon, my voice trembled as I tried to recount the events of the past 2 nights. "Daniel, you sound exhausted," she said, concern lacing every syllable. "Is it just the shift, or is something else bothering you?" I hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the creeping dread that had lodged itself in my thoughts. I don't know, Lisa. It's the morgue, the building. Last night was strange. There were these whispers, and objects weren't exactly where they should be. I even found markings on the paperwork. It might just be my mind playing tricks after too many hours of staring at cold metal and still bodies, but my voice trailed off into a silence laden with uncertainty. Lisa's gentle tone soothed me somewhat. "Listen, I know you're rational, Daniel. But sometimes, our minds pick up on things we can't explain. Maybe you need to get some rest, or even take a break from the morgue if it's starting to wear on you." Her words were caring yet laced with the unspoken recognition that my usual confidence was faltering. I assured her that I would try to rest, but deep inside, I was beginning to sense that this was no mere exhaustion. There was a systematic escalation, a series of events that defied logical explanation. I hung up the phone with a heavy heart, feeling both the warmth of friendship and the weight of an encroaching darkness that seemed to follow me with every step. Returning to the morgue later that night, I attempted to convince myself that the earlier disturbances were isolated incidents. I resumed my rounds with renewed caution. As I worked my way through the rows of bodies, I began noticing details that I hadn't before: a door that was slightly ajar, a faint, echoing creak from an empty storage compartment. The building, with all its history and whispered legends, seemed to be communicating in subtle, unsettling ways. The sound emanating from the storage area was peculiar, a series of low, irregular knocks that reverberated off the metal shelving. I approached the door cautiously, heart in my throat, and paused before pushing it open. The room beyond was pitch black, save for the faint luminescence of emergency exit signs. I flicked on the light, half expecting to see a maintenance worker or an errant colleague, but the space was entirely empty. The knocks had ceased, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence that pressed in on me from every side. My rational mind insisted it was nothing more than an errant mechanical noise or the building settling under its own weight. Yet, as I scribbled down notes in my log, a nagging thought kept rearing its head: what if these occurrences were part of a larger, inexplicable pattern? I examined the log again, the mysterious markings still staring back at me from the margins. They were nearly imperceptible, yet undeniably deliberate. I scanned each page with a growing sense of dread, wondering if there were other signs I'd missed, clues left behind by forces I couldn't yet understand. As midnight approached, I decided to take a brief respite in the hospital's break room. The sterile chatter of the vending machine and the muted hum of the refrigerator did little to quiet the storm raging in my mind. I sipped a lukewarm coffee, eyes unfocused, my thoughts drifting to the peculiar events that had marred my recent shifts. The conversation with Lisa replayed in my head, and I wondered if perhaps I should confide more openly in her about the escalating occurrences. But for now, I kept these details close, reluctant to burden anyone else with the weight of my disquiet. When I returned to the morgue, the atmosphere had grown noticeably thicker, as if the air itself had taken on a tangible density. I resumed my documentation and inspections with a methodical determination, even as my senses remained on high alert. Every sound, every flicker of light, was scrutinized with the hypervigilance of someone who had seen too much to simply ignore the anomalies. It was during one of these rounds that the strangest phenomenon occurred. As I was double-checking the refrigeration units, a chill passed over me, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that defied the usual consistency of the morgue's environment. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, and paused to listen. The low hum of the machinery seemed to distort, morphing into a series of overlapping tones that resonated with an almost musical quality. Then, from the edge of my vision, I saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow, more defined this time than before. I looked up slowly, my eyes darting from one corner of the room to another. There, near the far wall, a figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness before I could register its form. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken on a life, moving with purpose and intent. My pulse quickened as I strained to focus on the silhouette, but it had already faded into the background, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. Unsure of what I had just witnessed, I made my way to the doorway leading to the morgue's hallway. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, the overhead lights casting long, wavering beams that created a labyrinth of moving shadows. I hesitated at the threshold, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. For a split second, I almost expected to see that mysterious figure again, its form hovering in the liminal space between light and dark. I stepped out, half expecting a physical manifestation of my mounting fears. The hallway was empty, its silence punctuated only by the distant murmur of hospital activity. And yet, I could still feel the residue of that fleeting apparition, a presence that lingered just beyond the reach of my sight. It was as if the building had decided to reveal one of its hidden secrets, a secret that had been building in intensity with each passing hour. With every passing minute that night, the occurrences escalated. Not only were there more fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, but the objects in the morgue began to show signs of inexplicable movement. I recalled moments when a set of keys, which I had carefully placed on a metal tray, was later found on the floor without any logical explanation. At first, I attributed it to my absent-mindedness, but soon, a pattern emerged. It was as if an unseen force was rearranging the environment around me, a force that delighted in the disruption of order. My work became a battle against a creeping terror that threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. Every beep of a monitor, every shift in the ambient light, felt like a coded message from a realm that lurked just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. I began to record these anomalies more meticulously, scribbling down times, locations, and descriptions of each unsettling event. The notations in my log grew into a desperate attempt to cling to reason in the face of an encroaching, inexplicable darkness. At one point, while reviewing a series of patient files, I discovered that some of the documentation had been subtly altered. In one particular file, the patient's name was followed by a series of characters that I could not decipher, symbols that mirrored the markings I had found on the morgue paperwork. I held the file up to the light, turning it slowly in my hands as if expecting the mystery to unravel before my eyes. But the characters remained stubbornly enigmatic, their meaning lost to time and shadow. That was when I realized that the hospital itself might be complicit in this growing tapestry of mysteries. St. Aurelia's, with its long corridors and hidden corners, had always been a place steeped in history. Whispers of past tragedies, of lives cut short and secrets buried deep, were never far from the surface. And now, it seemed, those long-dormant memories were clawing their way back into the present, seeking acknowledgement in the most unorthodox of ways. By the latter part of the night, my isolation in the morgue had deepened. I found little solace even in the routine sounds of the facility. Every creak, every shift in the ambient noise, sent ripples of anxiety through my body. I could no longer dismiss these events as random or merely coincidental. Something was deliberately stirring in the depths of this place, and it was growing bolder with each tick of the clock. Then, as if the building itself had reached a crescendo of unresolved tension, I experienced a final, unambiguous moment that shattered any lingering doubt. While making my final rounds, I stepped into the hallway adjacent to the morgue, a narrow corridor where the light struggled to penetrate the heavy gloom. There, in the shifting interplay of light and shadow, I saw her. A fleeting apparition, unmistakable in its sorrowful clarity, drifted at the far end of the hall. Her form was blurred, as if seen through a veil of mist, but her eyes, if they could be called that, held an intensity of despair that rooted me to the spot. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst from my chest. The figure moved slowly, almost as if beckoning me forward, before dissolving into the darkness as abruptly as she had appeared. In that split second, all my rational explanations evaporated, replaced by a raw, undeniable certainty that I was no longer alone in this place. The spectral presence had made itself known, a silent witness to my mounting terror and a harbinger of what was yet to come. The vision lingered in my mind long after she had vanished, a haunting reminder that the boundaries of the ordinary were being pierced by forces beyond my comprehension. I retreated back to the morgue with a newfound urgency, my mind racing to reconcile what I had seen with everything I believed in. Every step felt laden with significance, as if the hospital's dark past and its hidden truths were converging in a way that would soon demand acknowledgement. That night, as I finally left the hospital and trudged back home under a sky heavy with unspoken omens, I could not shake the vivid image of that sorrowful apparition. Its presence was a stark, undeniable sign that the routine I had once trusted was now overrun with shadows that were only beginning to reveal their true forms. My thoughts swirled with questions. Who was she? What did she want? And how was it that these unexplained phenomena were entwined with my own life? In the quiet solitude of my modest apartment, I replayed the events in my mind, desperately trying to extract some semblance of logic from the chaos. The markings on the paperwork, the disarranged objects, the mysterious knocks from empty storage spaces, all of it wove a tapestry of mystery that both terrified and compelled me. I realized that my life, once governed by a comforting routine, had been irrevocably altered by the silent, creeping presence that now haunted the halls of St. Aurelia's. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, the image of the spectral figure burning in my eyes. Sleep eluded me as the shadows in my room seemed to twist and merge with the darkness outside. My rational mind, always so steadfast, was now locked in a desperate struggle with forces that defied explanation. I wondered if I would ever find a way to restore the balance between what was real and what lurked beyond the veil of the ordinary. As I drifted into an uneasy slumber, I could not help but feel that this was only the beginning of something far larger, a mystery that would unravel piece by piece, dragging me deeper into a realm where every shadow held a secret and every whisper was a prelude to the unknown. The hospital, with all its hidden histories and silent regrets, had become a stage for forces that were both ancient and unyielding, forces that would soon demand to be acknowledged. In that fragile twilight between wakefulness and dreams, I resolved to document every detail, every anomaly, in the hope that I might someday understand the dark tapestry that was weaving itself around me. Yet, even as I made that silent vow, a lingering doubt remained. Would the answers bring solace, or would they only serve to deepen the shadows that were already encroaching upon my soul? And so, with the memory of that sorrowful apparition etched indelibly into my mind, I closed my eyes, uncertain of what the next night would bring. The escalation of these shadows was undeniable, and I could only pray that I would be strong enough to face whatever lay ahead, aware now, more than ever, that the ordinary was a fragile facade, masking an underworld of secrets, regret, and untold mysteries waiting to be unearthed. Returning home that night felt like escaping a sinking ship, yet, as I fumbled with my keys at the door of my modest apartment, I couldn't shake the impression that my sanctuary had been compromised long before I crossed the threshold. The corridor outside my door was silent, its dim overhead light flickering in time with my pulse. I pushed the door open with a tentative hand, half expecting to see a stranger lurking in the shadows. Instead, I was met by an eerie stillness that cloaked every corner of my living space. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance: familiar furniture, the comforting hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. But as I stepped further into the room, I noticed subtle changes. The coffee table, usually aligned neatly with the sofa, had shifted ever so slightly. I paused, my brow furrowing in confusion. Had I moved it in a moment of absent-mindedness the night before? I couldn't recall doing so. My rational mind urged me to dismiss it as a minor oversight, yet an inexplicable chill crept up my spine. Later that evening, while I was absorbed in the quiet ritual of preparing dinner, I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper drifting through the darkness of my living room. I froze, the clatter of utensils in my hand halting midair. The sound wasn't coming from outside, nor did it seem to echo from within the walls. It was as if a voice, soft and pleading, had slipped through the cracks of reality, uttering a secret too fragile to be fully heard. I strained my ears, the whisper weaving itself into the silence, and for a moment, I thought I could discern the word, help. But when I turned on every lamp and checked behind the curtains, there was no one there, only the ghostly interplay of light and shadow. Sleep that night was elusive. I lay awake in my bed, heart pounding as I replayed the evening's unsettling events over and over. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the cool draft, echoed like a sign that I was not alone. Even in the isolation of my apartment, once a safe haven, an unseen presence now lurked, distorting the familiar into something foreign and threatening. The following morning, despite the gnawing dread that clung to me, I forced myself to resume my routine. The hospital was the one place where order reigned, a constant amidst the inexplicable. Yet even there, the disturbances had grown bolder, and I found that the boundaries between my work and my personal life were beginning to blur. As the day unfolded, I couldn't escape the feeling that the hospital's darkness was following me home, seeping into every corner of my existence. That afternoon, during a rare break between shifts, I confided in Lisa. We met at our favorite, unassuming cafe, its warm lighting and low murmur of conversation a stark contrast to the sterile halls of St. Aurelius. I recounted the unsettling events, the shifted furniture, the disembodied whispers, and the unnerving sensation of being watched even within my own home. "Daniel, you need to take this seriously," Lisa urged, her voice soft but firm as she reached out and placed a reassuring hand on mine. "This isn't just fatigue or the product of an overactive imagination. Something is very wrong." I shrugged off her concerns, insisting that it was all stress and the toll of working night after night among death and decay. "It's probably just my mind playing tricks on me," I muttered, attempting to sound more confident than I felt. Yet, even as I spoke, her worried eyes told me she wasn't convinced. "I think you should consider talking to someone, a professional, maybe. There's no shame in seeking help if your mind is under siege by these disturbances." Her words were laced with genuine concern, but I stubbornly clung to my rationality. I couldn't admit that my once unshakable belief in the natural order of things was now crumbling under the weight of the inexplicable. That evening, when I returned to the hospital after a brief respite, Marcus was waiting for me in a quiet corner of the break room. His expression was grave, a stark contrast to the easy camaraderie he usually displayed. "Daniel, you wouldn't believe the stories circulating among the night staff," he said, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "They're saying that the hospital is haunted by more than just the memories of its patients. There are accounts, old ghost stories that even I used to dismiss as mere folklore, about restless spirits that roam the halls. And now, with everything that's been happening, I'm starting to wonder if there's some truth to them." I listened, my heart sinking with each word he spoke. Marcus recounted tales passed down through generations of hospital workers, stories of unexplained apparitions, ghostly figures who materialized in the dead of night, and inexplicable events that defied logic. His voice trembled with a mixture of excitement and dread, as if every retelling of these spectral legends tightened the grip of an ancient terror on his soul. The notion that my experiences might not be isolated incidents, but part of a larger, sinister tapestry, filled me with a mounting sense of foreboding. A week passed in a haze of uneasy normalcy. By day, I buried myself in the routine tasks of the morgue, attempting to maintain a semblance of control over my fraying reality. By night, I struggled with the haunting disturbances in my apartment, each creak, each inexplicable movement reinforcing the belief that I was no longer alone. The line between the rational world of science and the shadowed realm of the paranormal had blurred beyond recognition, and I found myself teetering on the edge of disbelief. Then came the day that would force me to confront the unimaginable. I was rummaging through a stack of old files in the hospital archives, a task I rarely indulged in, yet now felt almost necessary, to search for any hints that might explain the inexplicable occurrences. Amidst the yellowed pages and dust-laden folders, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Tucked away between records of long-forgotten patients was a photograph of hospital staff from decades past. The image was sepia-toned, its edges frayed with age, yet the figures within were unmistakably presentable and composed, their eyes reflecting the dignity of a bygone era. What caught my attention, however, was not the formality of the gathering, but the face of one individual, a face that resonated with a strange familiarity. The man in the background, slightly blurred and overlooked by his peers, bore a striking resemblance to someone I had seen in passing at the hospital. His eyes, though faded by time, seemed to carry a deep sorrow, as if he had witnessed something unbearably tragic. I stared at the photograph, the weight of an unspoken question hanging in the air. Who was he, and why did his presence in that forgotten snapshot now feel so intimately connected to the disturbances I was experiencing? My mind raced with possibilities. Had this mysterious figure been an integral part of the hospital's past, a keeper of secrets perhaps, or a victim of some long-forgotten injustice? The more I pondered, the more I sensed that this was not merely a case of mistaken identity, but rather a thread leading deeper into the tangled web of the hospital's hidden history. I took the photograph carefully, as though it were a fragile relic of another era, and tucked it away in my jacket pocket. I knew that I had to learn more about him, even if the inquiry might open doors to realms I was desperate to keep shut. That night, as I returned to the relative isolation of my apartment, the disturbances escalated in a way that left me questioning my sanity. I arrived to find more evidence of intrusion. Every piece of furniture seemed to have been subtly shifted, as if by an unseen hand deliberately rearranging the familiar into a tableau of disquiet. The once sterile silence of my home was now punctuated by soft, desperate sobbing. It began as a distant sound, almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator, but soon it grew louder, resonating with an agonizing intensity that shook me to my core. I followed the sound down the darkened hallway, each step heavy with dread. The sobbing seemed to emanate from every corner, an overlapping chorus of despair that left no room for rational explanation. In a state of numb disbelief, I reached the living room only to find it shrouded in a darkness that was almost palpable. I flicked on the light switch, half expecting the noise to dissipate, but instead it surged again, a mournful cry that seemed to come from the very walls of the apartment. The sound was raw, filled with a sorrow that transcended time and defied logic, and in that moment, I could no longer deny the reality that the disturbances were not confined to the hospital alone. Desperate for answers, I combed through my memories of recent nights, every whispered word, every inexplicable movement, and began to piece together a narrative that pointed to something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The flickering lights and altered paperwork in the morgue, the chilling presence in the corridors, the shifted furniture and sorrowful sobbing at home, all of it now formed a mosaic of horror that begged for acknowledgement. In the days that followed, the haunting presence seemed to intensify, encroaching further into both my professional and personal lives. I found myself caught between two worlds, the sterile realm of scientific certainty at the hospital and the dark, intangible domain that had infiltrated my apartment. My nights were spent in restless vigil, half expecting the ghostly figure from the hallway to appear once again, her eyes pleading for recognition, or for some long overdue act of reparation. Lisa continued to urge me to seek help. "Daniel, you're not alone in this," she insisted during one of our late-night phone calls. "You need to talk to someone who understands these experiences, someone who isn't so entrenched in the logic of the everyday." But each time she mentioned the possibility of professional help or even a spiritual counselor, I dismissed it with a dismissive shake of the head. The idea that I might be succumbing to some unseen force, that my reality was shifting into something unrecognizable, was too terrifying to accept. I clung to the belief that there had to be a rational explanation, even as the evidence piled up like spectral footprints in my life. Marcus, too, offered his perspective. One night, after our shift ended and the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on us both, he pulled me aside near the staff locker room. "I know you don't want to hear it," he began hesitantly, "but there's more to this than random malfunctions or tired eyes. I've heard whispers from the older staff, stories about a nurse, a man, even patients who claim to have seen things that defy logic. They speak of a presence that wanders these halls, a tortured soul seeking acknowledgement. I never believed it until I witnessed something I can't even begin to describe." His words, delivered in a hushed tone that betrayed both fear and reverence, resonated with the fragments of the mystery I'd been piecing together. I recalled the photograph of the unknown man, the spectral figure from the corridor, and the anguished sobbing that now haunted my home. Could it be that all these events were linked by a shared history, a tragedy long buried beneath the veneer of hospital bureaucracy and modernity? That night, burdened by the inexorable weight of these converging realities, I found myself sitting alone in the dim light of my living room. The photograph lay on the coffee table before me, its sepia tones a stark reminder of a past that refused to remain silent. I traced a trembling finger along the outline of the man's face, the sorrow in his eyes speaking to me in a language older than words. In that silent confrontation with history, I felt an overwhelming need to know more, to seek out the truth behind the hospital's whispered legends and my own inexplicable experiences. But as I resolved to embark on this dangerous journey of uncovering hidden truths, the night delivered one final blow to my fragile sense of reality. A desperate cry, raw and unbearable, echoed through my apartment. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing, as the sound reverberated off the walls. It was not the soft, mournful sobbing of previous nights, but a cry steeped in agony and despair, an outcry that seemed to come from deep within the soul of the building itself. In that moment, I could no longer hide behind the veil of rationality. The undeniable evidence of an unearthly presence had overwhelmed every logical argument I had ever made. I sat there, frozen in a limbo of terror and sorrow, as the cry slowly faded into an eerie silence. The apartment, once a refuge from the cold rationality of the world, had become a theater of the inexplicable, a place where every creak and whisper served as a reminder that I was entangled in a mystery far beyond my control. Reluctantly, I acknowledged a truth I had long resisted: something paranormal was at work, something that had invaded both the sterile corridors of St. Aurelia's and the private corners of my life. I was no longer merely a rational morgue worker. Daniel, the meticulous and measured man, had become a reluctant witness to the unfolding of an ancient, sorrowful presence that defied explanation. As the hours dragged on and the first hints of dawn began to filter through my window, I felt the oppressive weight of isolation. I realized that seeking help from those outside this haunted circle might be the only way to reclaim some semblance of control. But even as the thought stirred within me, I also knew that once I stepped beyond the boundaries of my self-imposed solitude, I might irrevocably alter the fragile balance between the living and the dead. In the quiet aftermath of that desperate night, I gathered my thoughts and the scattered clues of a mystery that had become my burden. The moved furniture, the whispered pleas, the spectral photograph, and the agonized cries all formed a tapestry of evidence I could no longer ignore. I resolved, with a mix of dread and determination, that I would no longer stand by as a passive observer. I would confront the presence that had so unceremoniously invaded my life, even if doing so meant venturing into the dark recesses of a past fraught with hidden tragedies. That morning, with the photograph safely tucked away and a mounting resolve simmering beneath my terror, I reached out to both Lisa and Marcus. I admitted, haltingly and with a voice that wavered between skepticism and belief, that perhaps my experiences were not merely the product of an overworked mind. I confessed that something paranormal was indeed at work, and that I was desperate to find answers before the shadows claimed even more of my life. As I ended our conversation, the weight of my new reality pressed down upon me. I had crossed an irrevocable threshold, acknowledging the presence that haunted both my work and my home. And in that admission lay the seed of a journey that would unravel the long-suppressed secrets of St. Aurelius, a journey that would force me to confront not only the spectral past of a forgotten man but also the fragile boundaries of my own sanity. In the cold light of the new day, as I stared out of my window at the quiet city below, I couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The uninvited guest in my life had now made its presence known in ways that defied all reason, and I was left to face the chilling possibility that the darkness was only just beginning to reveal its true form. After the chilling events that had shaken both my professional and personal worlds, I knew that the only way to reclaim some semblance of control was to understand where these disturbances originated. I couldn't help but feel that the secrets hidden in the hospital's past were somehow linked to the restless presence that had begun haunting me, both at St. Aurelia's and at home. Reluctantly, I reached out to Lisa, whose unwavering support had been a beacon in these murky times, and we resolved to begin an investigation of our own. We would search the dusty corridors of forgotten archives and piece together the hospital's hidden history, even if it meant unearthing truths best left buried. Late one evening, when the hospital had quieted to its usual ghostly silence and the corridors were empty save for the distant hum of ventilation, Lisa and I met in a secluded corner of the hospital's administrative wing. We found a small, neglected records room, a cramped space lined with filing cabinets that creaked under the weight of decades of forgotten files. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed relentlessly, casting an unforgiving glare on the yellow documents scattered across the tables. I spread out several patient records before us, my hands trembling slightly as I rifled through dusty folders. "There has to be something here," I murmured, more to myself than to Lisa. "I'm looking for anything unusual, unexplained deaths, missing records, notes that don't belong." Lisa's eyes, usually filled with calm determination, flickered with concern as she surveyed the evidence. "Daniel, I know you're searching for answers, but sometimes these records are intentionally vague. People hide secrets in plain sight, and it takes a keen mind to see them." Hours passed in a tense silence as we pored over reams of hospital data, old death certificates, and incident reports that were filed in cramped handwriting and faded ink. Slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. There were clusters of deaths that had been marked as unexplained or sudden throughout the decades, a string of tragedies that occurred without clear medical cause. Some records, we noted, bore subtle discrepancies, dates that didn't match, or comments that hinted at cover-ups and misdirection. Every anomaly was like a breadcrumb, leading us deeper into a labyrinth of negligence, sorrow, and secrets. In one battered file dated back to the early 1960s, we discovered an incident described only in vague terms, a situation that had taken place on a stormy night and resulted in the untimely death of a nurse named Evelyn. The file was sparse in detail, a mere whisper of an event that had apparently sent ripples through the hospital's history. Her name, scrawled in a hurried script, was accompanied by a notation that simply read, "Incident unresolved. Further inquiry advised." I felt an involuntary shudder as I read those words. There was something haunting about the abruptness with which her fate was noted, as if those responsible had tried to erase the tragedy from collective memory. My thoughts raced as I considered the possibility that Evelyn's unresolved story might be the key to understanding the spectral occurrences that had plagued me. The idea that her spirit might be intertwined with the current disturbances grew more tangible with each piece of evidence we uncovered. "Lisa," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "what if Evelyn's death wasn't just a random tragedy? What if it was connected to all of this, the unexplained events, the whispers, the apparitions? It's as if the hospital itself has been hiding a dark secret, and her story is at its heart." Lisa's eyes met mine, and in them I saw both fear and resolve. "We have to know the truth," she insisted. "If Evelyn's story is tied to what you're experiencing, then uncovering her past might be the only way to put these restless spirits to rest, or at least to understand what they want." Her determination bolstered my own wavering courage, and together we resolved to dig deeper. Over the following weeks, our clandestine investigations took on an obsessive quality. Late at night, after our shifts at the morgue ended, we would huddle over old ledgers and archival files in the quiet solitude of my apartment or in the hushed corners of the hospital's records room. Each document we unearthed revealed hints of a much larger, more intricate web of secrets. There were references to an incident that spanned multiple files, small annotations here, a faded signature there, that all seemed to point back to that fateful night when Evelyn had met her tragic end. One evening, as I sat alone at my desk with the old photograph of the mysterious man from decades past still tucked safely away in my jacket pocket, I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. Exhausted and unsettled, I found myself drifting into a fitful sleep only to be tormented by vivid dreams. In these dreams, I was transported back to a time when the hospital was young and brimming with hope, a time when Evelyn was alive, full of promise, and yet haunted by an inexplicable dread. I saw her wandering the hallways, her expression a mix of sorrow and desperation, as if she were searching for something that could never be found. The dreams were so vivid that each morning I woke with tears in my eyes and a lingering sense of loss. In them, I heard her voice, a mournful plea echoing in the darkness, "Help me, remember me." These nocturnal visions blurred the line between memory and nightmare, and I began to fear that her tragedy was somehow seeping into my own reality. It wasn't long before Marcus caught wind of our investigation. One cold, rain-swept evening, as I was leaving the hospital archives with Lisa's research notes tucked under my arm, I found him waiting near the entrance, his face drawn and eyes glistening with a mix of apprehension and determination. "Daniel," he said in a hushed tone, "I've been hearing more about these stories from the old-timers. They say that what happened to Evelyn wasn't an isolated incident. There are local legends that speak of a series of mysterious deaths and unexplained disappearances around the hospital. Some even claim that the spirit of a wronged soul still roams these halls, seeking justice." His words, though delivered in a subdued manner, resonated with the fragments of information we had painstakingly gathered. Marcus explained that the hospital's dark past was well known among the long-serving staff, a tapestry of tragedy interwoven with rumors of cover-ups and untimely demises that were quickly hushed up. "There are whispers about a ritual, a desperate attempt to silence a voice that wouldn't be heard," he confided. "I don't know if it has anything to do with Evelyn, but many of the older nurses recall a night when something unexplainable happened, a night of terror and loss that changed the very spirit of this place." His account was laced with sorrow, and it lent an almost mythic quality to the investigation. With Marcus joining our quest, the trio of us began to draw lines between disparate pieces of evidence, constructing a tentative narrative of deceit, negligence, and a tragedy that had been meticulously buried under layers of bureaucracy and fear. One particularly cold night, the three of us gathered in a small, dimly lit room off the main archives. We had compiled every scrap of information related to Evelyn, the cryptic file notes, personal letters from long-retired staff, and even an old newspaper clipping that mentioned a mysterious incident at St. Aurelius. Marcus spread the documents out on the table, his fingers tracing the faded ink and rough edges of the paper as if he could physically grasp the past. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a line in one of the files that described an unaccounted-for loss during a stormy night in 1963. They never explained how a nurse could vanish in the midst of chaos, or why her name was expunged from the official records soon after. His voice was quiet but charged with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in. As we pieced together the fragments of Evelyn's story, it became clear that her fate was not a mere accident. There were hints of an internal struggle, a desperate cry for acknowledgement that had been silenced by those in power. Some files alluded to a confrontation between Evelyn and a senior administrator, a heated exchange that ended abruptly and left more questions than answers. The details were murky, clouded by decades of redaction and half-remembered accounts, yet the pain in the words leaped off the page. It was as if Evelyn's voice, suppressed and hidden away, had found its way into these documents, pleading to be heard once more. The more we uncovered, the more the hospital's present seemed to be haunted by the weight of its past. I couldn't help but see a parallel between the physical disturbances I had been experiencing, the shifted objects, the inexplicable sounds, the spectral apparitions, and the unresolved tragedy of Evelyn's untimely death. In every whispered detail and every faded note, I felt her presence growing stronger, as though the hospital's walls had absorbed her anguish and were now unwilling to let it rest. During the long, sleepless nights that followed, my dreams grew ever more intense. I found myself wandering through a version of the hospital that was shrouded in mist and sorrow, a place where time itself had fractured, revealing long-forgotten memories of pain and regret. In these dreams, I saw Evelyn in vivid detail. She was younger, her eyes bright yet marred by an inexplicable sadness, and her presence radiated a desperate urgency. I would follow her through dimly lit corridors, listening to her silent pleas as she beckoned me towards a door that always seemed just out of reach. Each time I awoke, drenched in sweat and with the echo of her voice still reverberating in my mind, I wondered if I was beginning to lose my grip on reality or if I was being given a glimpse of a truth too painful to ignore. The investigation was taking its toll on me. I felt my rational mind teetering on the brink of collapse as the boundary between the tangible present and the spectral past blurred further. Lisa, ever the steadfast friend, tried to keep me grounded. "Daniel, you need to rest," she implored one morning as we reviewed another set of archived records in my cluttered living room. "I know this is overwhelming, but you're chasing shadows in a way that's starting to hurt you." I tried to assure her that my mind was as clear as ever, that I was simply connecting the dots that had long been hidden. Yet, beneath my calm facade, a maelstrom of uncertainty churned. The deeper we delved into the records, the more I began to fear that I was being drawn into a vortex of memories and tragedies that might unravel not just the hospital's past, but my own sense of self. One document, in particular, sent a chill deep into my bones. It was a faded, almost illegible note that had been attached to an incident report from the night of Evelyn's death. The note was penned in hurried, trembling handwriting, and it contained a series of cryptic symbols alongside a few barely coherent words. Asterisk, "The silence of the forgotten shall not be denied." Asterisk. I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity, trying to decipher its meaning. Had someone meant it as a warning? Or was it a final, desperate plea from someone who had borne witness to a horror that defied explanation? I felt as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, with the vast, unfathomable truth lying just beyond my reach. Marcus, who had become increasingly involved in our late-night research sessions, leaned over my shoulder as I scrutinized the note. "Daniel," he said softly, "sometimes the past has a way of insisting that it's not forgotten. Perhaps this is Evelyn's way of reaching out, a message to anyone willing to listen." His words were laden with both conviction and resignation, as if he had long ago come to accept that some secrets were meant to persist. Yet, his willingness to engage with these mysteries gave me hope that we might finally piece together the narrative that had haunted these halls for so long. As the days turned into nights and back again, our investigation began to take on a life of its own. Lisa and I made secret trips to the hospital archives on weekends, while Marcus discreetly gathered testimonies from long-retired staff members who had witnessed events they dared not discuss openly. Every new piece of evidence felt like a shard of glass cutting through the veil of modernity, exposing raw, festering wounds in the hospital's history. The deeper we probed, the more the lines between fact and myth blurred, and I started to see echoes of Evelyn's tragedy in every unexplained death, every whispered rumor that lingered in the corridors. One rainy evening, after a particularly grueling day of research, I found myself alone in a cramped office at the back of the archives. The steady drumming of rain against the windowpane created a rhythm that mirrored my racing heartbeat. I leafed through an old ledger documenting incidents from the early days of St. Aurelius, and in its brittle pages I discovered an entry that sent a shiver racing down my spine. It described a night when multiple unexplained deaths had occurred, deaths that, according to official records, were attributed to misfortune and unknown causes. But the ledger's margins were filled with erratic, almost frantic annotations that mentioned Evelyn's cry and a call for justice. I pressed my trembling fingers to the paper, as if trying to absorb the sorrow and fury that it contained. In that moment, I realized that the hospital was not simply a repository of the dead, it was a mausoleum of secrets, each tragedy a silent witness to the injustices that had been swept under its immaculate floors. That revelation unsettled me to my core. I began to fear that my relentless pursuit of the truth might bring me face to face with a darkness that would consume me entirely. Yet, even as doubt gnawed at my resolve, I could not abandon the quest. Evelyn's name had become a rallying cry in my mind, a symbol of every untold story, every injustice that had been ignored. The presence that had tormented me for months seemed to intensify whenever I delved into her past, as if her spirit were urging me onward, desperate to have her voice heard and her story remembered. In the quiet moments before dawn, I found myself writing down my thoughts in a worn notebook, a habit I had adopted to make sense of the ever-multiplying fragments of evidence and emotion. My scribbled notes became a tapestry of theories, memories, and raw impressions, accounts of spectral apparitions in the morgue, the faded scars on ancient documents, and the echo of a long-forgotten cry that seemed to come from the depths of the hospital itself. Each entry was a desperate attempt to document the intangible, to pin down the essence of a mystery that threatened to devour the rational parts of my mind. And then, almost imperceptibly, changes began to manifest
your
in my
gateway
own
to soothing
perceptions.
mysteries and chilling whispers.
I started noticing
I'm
subtle
here to help
shifts
you
in the
unwind and
hospital's
explore
environment that I
captivating
had
tales that
previously
lurk in the
overlooked.
shadows.
The
Remember
air
to
in the
like,
corridors would
subscribe,
suddenly
and drop
grow
a comment
cold,
sharing
and
where
the distant
and when you're
sound of a
listening.
woman's lament would echo
Now,
down
relax
empty
and let the
hallways.
night embrace you.
In the quiet recesses of the morgue, where I once found solace in order and routine, now sensed a profound sorrow, as if the walls themselves were mourning a loss too deep to articulate. It was in those moments that I felt Evelyn's presence most acutely, a spectral witness to the tragedies of the past reaching out through the veil of time. One particularly harrowing night, as I left the archives with Lisa and Marcus after another long session of uncovering secrets, I felt a presence trailing me in the deserted corridors of the hospital. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic echo of my footsteps and the soft patter of rain on the windows. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure in the dim light. For a fleeting moment, in the periphery of my vision, I saw a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform standing just beyond the reach of the light. Her face was pale, her eyes full of a sorrow so profound it nearly paralyzed me. But when I turned fully to look, she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense of loss and an unspoken plea for justice. That encounter marked a turning point. I began to understand that the hospital's present was inseparable from its past, and that every unexplained event was a thread in a tapestry woven long before my time. The investigation was no longer a matter of curiosity, it was a race against the encroaching darkness that threatened to swallow everything I held dear. The more I learned about Evelyn, the more I feared for my own sanity. Every detail, every faded line in the documents, seemed to converge on a single, relentless narrative of injustice and sorrow. As I closed another folder detailing a particularly grim case of unexplained death, I sat back and tried to steady my breathing. The documents were more than mere records, they were the silent confessions of a history that had been kept hidden, a history that was now demanding to be heard. In the dim light of that rain-soaked evening, with Lisa's reassuring presence at my side and Marcus's quiet determination echoing in the background, I vowed that we would not let the truth be buried any longer. Evelyn's name would be spoken, and the ghosts of the past would finally have the recognition they so desperately sought. In that moment, as the storm raged outside and the hospital's old walls groaned under the weight of its secrets, I felt a resolute determination swell within me. I understood that uncovering the full extent of Evelyn's tragedy might force me to confront horrors beyond my wildest nightmares, but it was a confrontation I could no longer avoid. The past was not dead, it was alive, pulsing through every crevice of St. Aurelia's, whispering of wrongs that had yet to be righted. As I recorded these thoughts in my notebook that night, I couldn't help but wonder if the answers we sought would bring closure, or if they would open the door to an even deeper darkness. But as I stared at the scattered pages and the dim reflection of my weary eyes in the window, I knew one thing for certain: the search for Evelyn's truth was a path I had to walk, no matter where it led. And in that journey, I hoped that perhaps, by giving voice to the silenced, I could finally find some measure of redemption for both the past and for myself. With that resolve burning quietly within me, I closed the notebook and rose from my desk. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, a relentless pull that defied my rational mind and whispered of secrets too profound to be ignored. I knew that the road ahead was fraught with peril, that every step further into the labyrinth of the hospital's history might bring me closer to truths that could shatter the fragile boundaries of my reality. Yet, with Lisa and Marcus at my side, I felt a tentative hope that perhaps we could piece together the fragments of a long-forgotten tragedy and, in doing so, cast light upon the shadows that had haunted us for so long. As I stepped out into the night, the cool air filled with the promise of revelations and regrets, I felt Evelyn's silent plea echoing in the darkness. The hospital's past was calling, and I, Daniel, once a man of cold reason and measured routine, had been irrevocably changed by its mournful song. With each step I took, I knew that the path to understanding would be paved with both heartache and the possibility of redemption, and that the truth, however terrible it might be, was waiting to be unearthed from the depths of the forgotten. And so, beneath the relentless patter of rain and the somber glow of streetlights, I pressed forward into the unknown, determined to confront the legacy of sorrow that had long haunted the halls of St. Aurelia's, and, in doing so, to finally set both the living and the dead free from the shackles of their silent, unspoken grief. Sleep had become a distant memory, a precious commodity that now eluded me night after night. The days merged into a blurred haze, punctuated only by the relentless pursuit of truth and the ever-encroaching whispers of a spirit desperate to be acknowledged. I found myself teetering on the brink of exhaustion, my mind no longer a safe refuge of reason but a chaotic theater where memories, hallucinations, and dread intermingled. It was during one of these long, agonizing nights that I experienced the most vivid and terrifying apparition yet, Evelyn's presence, distorted and raw, pleading wordlessly for recognition. I was alone in the morgue after my shift had ended. The only sound was the hum of refrigeration units and the irregular drip of condensation on cold metal. I sat in a chair at one end of the room, the overhead lights flickering as if struggling to hold back a tide of darkness. My eyes burned from lack of sleep and my thoughts spun uncontrollably, each tick of the clock a reminder of my vulnerability. In the corner, I suddenly sensed a presence that was both foreign and intimately familiar. It started as a shape, a mere distortion of shadow and light, but soon the figure began to take on a form. I watched in frozen terror as a pale, indistinct outline of a woman emerged from the darkness. The features were grotesquely blurred, as if viewed through a veil of tears, and yet in that amorphous face I recognized the unmistakable anguish of Evelyn. Her eyes, hollow and pleading, locked onto mine. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I could feel her silent desperation, her need to communicate a pain that transcended the boundaries of life and death. She reached out toward me with a hand that was both ephemeral and tremulous, her lips parting as if to cry out, but no sound emerged, only the haunting language of a broken soul. The vision dissipated almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me gasping in the oppressive silence. I struggled to comprehend what I had seen, my rational mind clashing violently with the undeniable horror of the moment. In that instant, every suppressed secret, every faint whisper of the past, converged upon me like an avalanche. I knew that Evelyn's spirit was not a passive echo of a forgotten tragedy. She was here, now, and her presence was becoming bolder, more insistent. The following morning, with the taste of dread lingering on my tongue, I met with Lisa and Marcus in our usual clandestine location, a cramped corner of the hospital's archives. The room, lit by a single, flickering fluorescent tube, reeked of must and old paper. Stacks of archived records towered precariously around us as we spread out the evidence we had accumulated over the past weeks. My hands still trembled from the night's encounter, and I could scarcely concentrate on the faded documents before me. "Daniel, you look worse than I imagined," Lisa remarked softly as she carefully arranged a bundle of yellowed files. Her eyes, filled with equal parts concern and determination, searched mine for any hint of the horror that had shaken me. "Tell us everything." I recounted every detail, the inexplicable chill in the morgue, the shifting of shadows, and most vividly, the apparition of Evelyn. My voice faltered as I described her pleading eyes and the desperate reach of her spectral hand. Lisa's expression hardened with resolve, while Marcus's gaze grew intense as he listened. It was clear that our investigation was at a crossroads. If Evelyn's ghost had manifested so forcefully in the morgue, what did that mean for the investigation into her mysterious death? Marcus, who had been meticulously combing through patient records for months, finally interjected, "I've found something. I know it might not look like much right now, but there's an inconsistency in Evelyn's death record." He leaned forward, sliding a brittle, nearly illegible document toward me. The paper was stained and marked with corrections, as though it had been tampered with or hastily altered. The record mentioned her name, the date of her death, and some ambiguous notes, but crucial details, her cause of death, the circumstances surrounding the incident, were conspicuously missing. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I scanned the document. "It's as if they've tried to erase her story," I murmured, almost to myself. Lisa frowned, her eyes reflecting both shock and sorrow. "This could be the cover-up we've suspected for so long. They intentionally left gaps in the record, as if trying to hide something very specific." Marcus nodded slowly, his voice low and determined. "The more I dig, the more it seems that Evelyn's death wasn't an accident or a mere misfortune. There were witnesses who mentioned a confrontation, hints of coercion, and, most disturbingly, a fervor to silence her. And now, with these gaps in the official record, it appears that someone, somewhere, decided that her memory wasn't worth preserving." The weight of his words pressed down on me. I recalled the dreamlike sequences I had experienced, where Evelyn's face morphed into a distorted mask of grief and rage, her eyes silently accusing the living of a betrayal that spanned decades. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her ghost was not simply a passive remnant of the past. Instead, she was actively reaching out, her spectral manifestations growing increasingly forceful as if in a desperate bid for justice. Over the next few nights, my sleep continued to elude me. I became haunted by a relentless cycle of exhaustion and terror. The boundary between wakefulness and dreams blurred to the point where I could no longer trust my own senses. In the darkness of my apartment, I began to hear not only the soft echoes of my own thoughts but also the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice, a fragile, trembling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Remember me, help me." The voice was both mournful and commanding, a desperate plea that drove me to the edge of sanity. I remember one particular night in vivid, harrowing detail. It was nearly midnight, and I had just returned from another grueling day at the hospital. The apartment was shrouded in silence, but as I tried to settle into a fitful rest, the voice began again. This time, it was accompanied by a palpable shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding in my chest, and listened as the voice grew louder, echoing in the emptiness of my room. I could almost see a shape forming at the edge of my vision, a blurred silhouette that seemed to hover by the window, its presence suffused with an urgent melancholy. I reached for the light, but when I flicked the switch, the figure had vanished, leaving behind an echo of sorrow and a lingering chill that seeped into my bones. The following morning, I recounted the episode to Lisa and Marcus, my voice raw with the weight of sleepless terror. "It's not just in the hospital anymore," I insisted, the words trembling on my lips. "It's following me home. I can't tell if I'm losing my mind or if she's becoming desperate. I hear her voice every night, and the way she appears, it's as if she's trying to break through the barrier that keeps her in the shadows." Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she reached out and clasped my hand. "Daniel, you're not alone in this. We have to confront it head-on, for your sake and for hers. There's a reason she's chosen to make herself known now. It must be something that demands acknowledgement, something that won't rest until it's been heard." Marcus, ever the pragmatist, added quietly, "We need to get to the bottom of this. Evelyn's record is our best lead. If we can uncover the truth behind her death, maybe we can give her the closure she seems to crave. And perhaps, in doing so, we can put an end to these terrifying manifestations." Emboldened by their support, we began a more focused effort to uncover every hidden detail related to Evelyn's death. We sought access to deeper layers of the hospital's archives, including records that had been long forgotten or purposely obscured by successive layers of bureaucracy. However, our inquiries quickly ran into stiff resistance. Requests for additional documentation were met with vague denials, and the archivists, the custodians of the hospital's past, seemed unnerved by our persistent probing into subjects that were clearly considered off-limits. One afternoon, as we stood before a locked filing cabinet deep within a rarely used wing of the archives, a stern administrator arrived unexpectedly. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed our disheveled piles of files and our intense, almost desperate expressions. "I must ask you to refrain from further tampering with these records," he said in a clipped tone. "There are protocols in place for a reason, and certain matters are not meant for public scrutiny." I tried to explain, in my best calm voice, "Sir, we're merely trying to piece together the truth about an incident that has haunted this institution for decades. It's about preserving the memory of someone who deserves to be remembered." But he was unmoved. "Some stories are best left undisturbed," he replied coldly, before turning and leaving us in the dim light of the archive room. The encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth, a clear message that there were forces, both human and perhaps otherwise, determined to keep Evelyn's story buried. That very evening, as I pored over the incomplete death record Marcus had found, a new wave of terror struck me. The document's gaps and redactions seemed almost to pulsate with a hidden life of their own, as if the very paper was trying to conceal a secret too powerful to be allowed into the light. In the quiet isolation of my apartment, I could feel the oppressive presence of Evelyn's sorrow seeping into every corner of my mind. The voice returned with renewed urgency, but this time it was accompanied by a sound that chilled me to the core, a low, guttural moan, as if coming from the depths of a long-forgotten crypt. In one harrowing moment, as I lay on my couch staring blankly at the wall, I distinctly heard her voice rise above the murmur. "I need you." The syllables were fragmented, filled with a desperation that transcended language. I scrambled to my feet, convinced that she was right there in the room with me, desperate to be seen, to be acknowledged. I fumbled for my phone, half expecting to capture a recording of the spectral plea, but the device remained silent. All I was left with was the echo of that single, tortured cry and the overwhelming certainty that I could no longer ignore the truth that was unfolding before me. The next morning, while my eyes remained bloodshot from nights of relentless insomnia, Marcus approached me with a grim set to his features. "Daniel," he said, lowering his voice as if the words themselves might summon further shadows, "I found something in the old hospital records that might explain a lot." He handed me a slim, dog-eared folder containing an excerpt from an internal investigation report dating back to the early 1960s, the time of Evelyn's death. The report was terse and oddly incomplete. Large sections were either blank or filled with cryptic notations. More disturbing, however, was a handwritten annotation scrawled in the margin, "*Case closed. Subject classified. Do not reopen. **. I stared at the document, feeling as if a door had swung open in my mind, a door that revealed a chasm of hidden truths and deliberate silences. The implications were staggering. Not only had Evelyn's death been shrouded in mystery, but there was an active effort to ensure that her story remained suppressed. They didn't just want to forget her, I whispered, more to myself than to Marcus. They wanted to erase her entirely. Lisa, who had been silently absorbing every word, reached out and squeezed my hand. "We have to bring this to light, Daniel. This isn't just about a cover-up, it's about setting things right, for Evelyn and for everyone who suffered in silence." That night, as darkness fell once again over my restless world, I resolved to confront the growing intensity of Evelyn's spectral presence. The manifestations were no longer subtle anomalies but aggressive intrusions into my reality. I prepared myself for what I knew might be the most harrowing encounter yet. I armed myself with a recorder, a flashlight, and my resolve to face the unknown, determined to capture undeniable evidence of her existence and her anguish. I returned to the morgue after midnight, when the hospital was empty and the corridors echoed with the silence of a sleeping giant. The air was colder than ever, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of memories too potent to be dismissed. I stood alone by one of the refrigerated units, my breath visible in the frigid air, and waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and then, almost imperceptibly, the temperature plummeted further. A dense fog of cold seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and I knew she was near. And then I saw her again. Not as a vague shadow, but as a full, anguished apparition. Evelyn stood before me in the dim light, her figure distorted by a tremor of static energy. Her once gentle features were now contorted in silent agony, and her eyes, once filled with the quiet compassion of a dedicated nurse, were transformed into twin pools of despair and regret. She opened her mouth, and this time, the sound that emerged was not the inaudible whisper of before, but a clear, quavering voice that echoed around me, "Remember me. I am here. I never belonged to silence." The sound reverberated through the cold, sterile air, a plea that shattered the quiet and resonated with every fiber of my being. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to step forward, to reach out and offer what little comfort I could, but the sheer intensity of her presence pinned me in place. Her form wavered like a candle flame in a gust, and as I watched, tears streamed silently down her spectral cheeks. In that moment, the room seemed to pulse with the sorrow of decades, the oppressive history of Saint Aurelius laid bare before my eyes. I fumbled with my recorder, desperate to capture her anguished words, but the device sputtered and fell silent, as if even technology was powerless in the face of such raw emotion. All I could do was stand there, frozen in time, as Evelyn's image reached out with both longing and despair. "You must remember," she repeated, her voice softer now yet laced with an urgency that brooked no delay. "You must remember, and tell them of my truth." In that charged moment, every suppressed fragment of the hospital's dark history surged into focus. The gaps in her record, the rushed annotations, the deliberate obfuscation of her death, they were not random omissions. They were part of a calculated effort to erase a tragedy that had left scars on the very soul of this institution. And now, with Evelyn's voice breaking through the silence, I realized that I was the only one who could bring her story to light. After what felt like an eternity, her form began to fade, dissolving into the chill of the morgue. I remained rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a dawning sense of purpose. I knew that my life, and indeed, the legacy of Saint Aurelius, could never be the same. Evelyn's ghost had not only revealed the depth of the injustice inflicted upon her, but it had also entrusted me with the responsibility of ensuring that her truth would no longer be silenced. In the days that followed, I found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the relentless pace of my insomnia with the gravity of my discoveries. The hospital, once a fortress of order and clinical detachment, now pulsed with secrets and ghosts that demanded acknowledgement. Lisa and Marcus stood by me through countless late-night meetings, our discussions a frenzied tapestry of documents, whispered recollections from retired staff, and the ever-present echoes of Evelyn's voice. Each piece of evidence we uncovered only deepened the mystery, yet also fortified our determination to challenge the forces that had conspired to bury the past. Marcus continued his painstaking search for additional records, while Lisa reached out to contacts who might have witnessed or remembered the fateful night of Evelyn's death. I, for my part, began to document every spectral encounter, every shift in temperature and sound that seemed to herald her presence. With each passing day, Evelyn's ghost grew more assertive, her appearances more frequent and laden with a palpable urgency. At times, I would find myself alone in the darkened halls of the morgue, where the static of my thoughts was interrupted by her quiet, mournful pleas, echoing through the silence, "I need you to remember." The duality of my existence became painfully apparent. By day, I was the meticulous morgue worker, bound by duty in the cold logic of science. By night, I was a reluctant vessel for the voices of the dead, an unwilling chronicler of a tragedy that refused to remain confined to the annals of time. And through it all, Evelyn's voice, the voice that had first broken the barrier of silence, remained both a comfort and a curse. It was a reminder of the injustice she had suffered and a beacon calling me toward a truth that would upend the very foundations of what I once believed. One dreary afternoon, as rain battered the hospital windows and the corridors echoed with the low murmur of a building steeped in secrets, I found myself in a quiet moment of reflection in my small, cluttered office. The incomplete death record lay open before me, its cryptic notations a taunting testament to a story deliberately left unfinished. I could almost hear Evelyn's voice whispering from between the faded lines, urging me to piece together the fragments of her shattered past. I knew then that the next step in our journey was inevitable. We had to confront the hospital administration directly. Armed with our accumulated evidence and the raw, unfiltered accounts of those who had witnessed inexplicable events, Lisa, Marcus, and I scheduled a meeting with a senior hospital official. The conversation that ensued was laced with tension and thinly veiled hostility. The administrator, a man who prided himself on maintaining order and propriety, dismissed our inquiries with curt, evasive answers. "The records are as they are," he insisted, and there is nothing more to be discussed. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, a silent admission that perhaps the past was more complicated than the official narrative allowed. Frustrated yet undeterred, we left the meeting with the resolve to continue our investigation, no matter how many barriers were erected to conceal the truth. In the weeks that followed, as I continued to struggle against sleep and the constant, spectral presence of Evelyn, I began to compile my own detailed account of events, a diary of every chilling encounter, every whispered plea, and every piece of damning evidence that pointed to the deliberate erasure of her story. Late one night, as I sat hunched over my desk in the solitude of my apartment, I heard her voice again, clearer and more insistent than ever before. "Remember me. Tell them what happened." This time, the voice was not distant or muffled by the veil of dreams. It resonated with the weight of centuries of silence and demanded action. Overwhelmed by a sense of urgency and the undeniable truth of her words, I vowed then and there that I would not rest until Evelyn's story was known. I would confront the bureaucracy, expose the hidden chapters of the hospital's past, and, in doing so, grant her the long-overdue acknowledgement that she so desperately craved. Standing at the threshold of a darkness that threatened to consume me, I knew that my journey had reached a pivotal juncture. Evelyn's ghost had transformed from a mere spectral anomaly into a desperate messenger, a spirit who had transcended the boundaries of death to implore the living to remember, to acknowledge, and ultimately, to set her free. As I looked out the rain-streaked window at the bleak, indifferent city beyond, I felt both terror and a profound sense of responsibility. The revelations in the darkness were clear: the past could not be undone, but it could be brought into the light if only someone dared to remember. And so, with the sound of Evelyn's final plea echoing in my mind, "I am here. I need you to remember," I steeled myself for the battles ahead. The confrontation with the hospital's hidden past, the challenge of breaking through layers of silence and obfuscation, and the struggle to preserve my own sanity in the face of an ever-growing darkness would test me beyond measure. Yet, I could no longer stand aside. For every whispered secret, for every record redacted and every life silenced, I would fight to ensure that Evelyn's voice would ring clear and true. In that moment, I realized that the journey had only just begun. The revelations in the darkness had unlocked a door to a truth that was as terrifying as it was essential, a truth that demanded to be heard, no matter the cost. And as I continued down this perilous path, I vowed to honor Evelyn's memory by unearthing every hidden secret, every silent injustice, and by ensuring that the echoes of her suffering would finally be transformed into a clarion call for justice. Thus, standing amidst the ruins of the past and the encroaching darkness of the present, I prepared myself for the next chapter of a journey that would forever blur the lines between the living and the dead, a journey fueled by the desperate need to remember, to honor, and ultimately, to redeem a legacy marred by silence. The nights grew longer and the shadows thicker. With every passing hour, I could feel the relentless pressure of guilt and dread wrapping tighter around my heart. My body ached as if each step was a struggle against invisible forces, and my mind, once the bastion of reason, now teetered on the brink of collapse. The ghostly encounters, the ceaseless whisperings, and the echo of Evelyn's plaintive calls had begun to manifest in physical ways. I found myself waking in cold sweats, my head pounding with an intensity that left no doubt: something was breaking through the barrier between the living and the dead. It wasn't just the long hours and sleepless nights at St. Aurelia's that were taking their toll, even my co-workers had begun to notice the change. In the hushed corridors of the morgue, eyes met mine with an unspoken question. Marcus, who had been my stalwart ally through these investigations, pulled me aside one bleak afternoon. "Daniel, you're not yourself," he said in a low, urgent whisper as we stood near the quiet hum of the refrigeration units. "You're shaking more than the usual after a long shift. I've seen you lose focus, almost as if the weight of everything is dragging you down. We're worried, man." I forced a smile that I knew was brittle, replying, "It's nothing. Just exhaustion, I guess. The nights are getting longer, and the work, it's relentless." But even as I said it, I felt my hands trembling, and my heart pounded with the memory of Evelyn's sorrowful gaze. Lisa's concern had grown too. Over late-night phone calls, she'd cautioned me, "Daniel, I fear that the spirit of Evelyn isn't just haunting these halls, it might be entwining itself with you. Your dreams, your waking hours, it's as if her pain and your guilt are merging, and I'm scared for you." Her words reverberated within me like a bell tolling an ominous warning. The manifestations, once subtle anomalies, were now dangerously tangible. In the dead of night, objects in the morgue began to move with an almost malevolent intent. I would catch sight of drawers sliding open on their own, cabinets creaking as if in protest, and an inexplicable chill would envelop me whenever I passed the window behind which the past seemed to murmur its regrets. It was as if the hospital itself had become a living, breathing monument to all the suppressed grief and injustice that had accumulated over decades. Amid this escalating turmoil, I found solace in the painstaking work of piecing together Evelyn's tragic story. Together, Lisa, Marcus, and I pored over every document we could salvage from the hidden recesses of the hospital archives. Late into the night, with the soft glow of our desk lamps fighting back the darkness, we discovered more than we had bargained for. The official records of Evelyn's death were riddled with omissions, inconsistencies, and deliberate redactions, a tapestry of evidence that hinted at a cover-up orchestrated by those who wished to bury a truth too painful to acknowledge. One brittle file, yellowed by time and stained by decades of neglect, recounted the events leading up to that fateful night. According to the sparse entries, Evelyn had been at odds with a group of influential figures within the hospital. The note spoke of heated exchanges in hushed tones and corridors where secrets festered. A senior nurse, whose name had been carefully expunged from the records, had allegedly witnessed a confrontation between Evelyn and a high-ranking administrator, whispers of a struggle for power, and, more disturbingly, hints that Evelyn had been silenced for daring to speak out against a malpractice that reached to the highest echelons of the institution. Marcus, poring over a faded memo he'd uncovered, pointed to a scrawled annotation that read, "Accountability not afforded to those in power." His voice was barely audible as he said, "Daniel, this isn't just a cover-up, it's a conspiracy. They wanted her voice to be lost forever." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as the words sank in. It wasn't just Evelyn's personal tragedy that was at stake, it was the very integrity of the institution, a dark stain that had been meticulously hidden away. The more we uncovered, the more my internal torment grew. In the solitude of the morgue, I began to experience increasingly vivid visions of Evelyn. At times, I would see her reflection in the polished metal surfaces, a ghostly visage, her eyes brimming with sorrow and accusation. Other times, in the quiet moments between tasks, her image would intrude upon my thoughts, her hands reaching out as if to bridge the gap between her broken past and my crumbling present. It felt as though her spirit was entwining itself with my own consciousness, seeding guilt and despair deep within me. One particularly harrowing night, after a day of endless research and unrelenting interviews with retired staff members, I returned home to find my apartment in disarray. Every piece of furniture was shifted just enough to be noticeable, photographs lay askew on the floor, and a persistent cold draft seemed to breathe through the walls. The most unsettling evidence, however, was the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway, a steady, deliberate pace that grew louder and then faded into silence. In the dim light of my living room, I found myself muttering, "It's not just in the hospital anymore," as a feeling of dread enveloped me, making it clear that the paranormal disturbances had crossed into my sanctuary. The culmination of these events forced me to confront the hospital administration directly. With the files and testimonies meticulously compiled into a dossier, I scheduled a meeting with a senior official whose expression, I hoped, would reveal some inkling of accountability. The meeting was held in a sterile, overly bright conference room where the weight of authority hung in the air like a suffocating fog. I laid out the evidence, documented anomalies in the records, eyewitness accounts, and the chilling personal encounters that had left me visibly shaken. "Sir, I'm asking for a thorough review of the incident involving Nurse Evelyn," I began, my voice steadier than I felt inside. "The records indicate discrepancies, and there are multiple testimonies that suggest her death was not a mere accident." My tone was firm, yet beneath it lay a current of desperation, a plea for justice not just for Evelyn, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence. The administrator's face remained impassive, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened. "Mr. Daniels, you must understand that we operate within strict regulatory frameworks," he said coldly. "The records are final. There is no room for reinterpretation or speculation." His dismissive tone stung sharply, and I felt a surge of anger and frustration rise within me. I pressed further, detailing the evidence of cover-ups and even hinting at coercive actions taken by those in positions of power. But every word was met with the same cold deflection. "You're suggesting a conspiracy against the institution," he said, his voice laced with disbelief and thinly veiled hostility. "I assure you, Mr. Daniels, that such allegations are unfounded and highly inappropriate. I recommend you focus on your duties rather than indulging in baseless theories." His words felt like a physical blow, and for a moment, I considered whether my mind, already fraying at the edges, had finally succumbed to delusions. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. In private conversations with some of the older staff, and in the fading ink of hospital files, the threads of guilt that had long been concealed began to intertwine into a coherent, albeit terrifying, narrative. It became clear that a select few, vested in maintaining their power and reputation, had deliberately manipulated events. Their actions had not only silenced Evelyn's voice but had also sown the seeds of a malevolent presence that now haunted both the hospital and my very being. In the aftermath of the meeting, the fallout was immediate and severe. I found myself suspended from duty, a decision cloaked in bureaucratic language yet painfully clear in its intent, to remove a troublemaker who dared challenge the official story. My co-workers cast furtive glances as I passed the sterile hallways, their eyes a mixture of pity, fear, and perhaps relief that I had not been swallowed entirely by the institution's dark underbelly. Even Marcus's once confident gaze now carried a hint of trepidation, as if the mere act of questioning the status quo had awakened something far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. At home, the disturbances escalated into something that defied explanation. The boundary between the spectral and the physical world began to dissolve. Doors would slam on their own, faint voices whispered from the corners of rooms, and, most disturbingly, there were moments when I could almost feel a cold, insistent hand brushing against my skin in the dead of night. The paranormal was no longer confined to isolated encounters in the morgue or in the silent corridors of the hospital. It had become an invasive presence in every aspect of my life. During one particularly dismal night, as rain pounded relentlessly against the windows of my apartment, I awoke to a sensation that chilled me to the bone. I had been half asleep when I felt a shift in the air, a presence so potent it seemed to compress the space around me. I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering, and there, illuminated only by the faint light of a street lamp filtering through the curtains, was a figure. It was Evelyn, her form more solid than ever, her eyes reflecting a sorrow so deep that I felt the weight of centuries in her gaze. In that moment, I experienced a jolt of terror and an overwhelming surge of guilt. It was as if her spirit was no longer an external force but was seeping into me, merging with the remnants of my soul. Her silent plea, an amalgam of despair and accusation, resonated in every fiber of my being. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, as if the boundary between who I was and who I was becoming was dissolving before my eyes. Lisa's voice echoed in my memory as she had warned me, "Daniel, I'm afraid that Evelyn's spirit is not just haunting you, she's merging with your vulnerable mind." And in that bleak moment, I could not help but wonder if the relentless guilt of uncovering her story had made me a vessel for her anguish. The merging of our essences was not merely a psychological burden, it began to manifest physically. I started experiencing strange phenomena in my reflection. For fleeting seconds, the glass of mirrors would show not just my own tired face, but the spectral outline of a woman with eyes full of sorrow. I'd catch my reflection blinking in time with an unseen rhythm, and in those moments, I wasn't sure if I was looking at myself or at Evelyn's unbidden presence. The line between guilt, grief, and the supernatural blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Desperate to reclaim some semblance of control, I sought solace in Lisa and Marcus, leaning on them as my anchor in the storm of guilt and terror. In hushed, late-night conversations held in the back room of an old diner, we debated our next move. "We need to expose the truth," Marcus insisted, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of fear. "If we do nothing, these forces will only grow stronger, and you, Daniel, will be lost in them." Lisa, ever compassionate yet resolute, added softly, "I'm scared for you, Daniel. I've seen how this journey has eroded you. But we owe it to Evelyn, and to ourselves, to bring this cover-up into the light." It was in that crucible of despair and determination that we decided our next step, to unmask those who had orchestrated the silence around Evelyn's death. We began tracing the threads of guilt back to individuals who had been present on that tragic night and who had later moved into positions of influence within the hospital's administration. Through secret interviews with retired staff members, whispered recollections in dimly lit hospital cafeterias, and painstaking cross-referencing of old personnel files, we identified several names, figures whose careers had flourished while evidence of their complicity had been systematically erased. One name, in particular, emerged with a chilling clarity: Dr. Aldridge, a senior administrator whose reputation for efficiency was marred by hushed rumors of unethical decisions and unexplained disappearances among dissenting staff. The more we investigated, the more we realized that Dr. Aldridge had been at the heart of the efforts to silence Evelyn. His signature appeared on several redacted documents. His memos hinted at necessary measures taken to ensure that certain incidents remained classified. It was as if he had built an impenetrable wall around the hospital's darkest secret, a wall that we were now determined to tear down, no matter the personal cost. Armed with this damning information, I attempted once more to confront the hospital's leadership. I requested a formal meeting with Dr. Aldridge, hoping that presenting the evidence would force him to acknowledge the truth. The meeting was set in a sterile conference room, its walls adorned with accolades and certificates, a shrine to a man who had cultivated an image of infallibility. As I laid out the evidence before him, my voice wavered between indignation and sorrow. "Dr. Aldridge, these documents, these testimonies, paint a clear picture of a cover-up that goes far deeper than a mere administrative error. Nurse Evelyn's death was not an accident. It was the consequence of deliberate actions taken to protect those in power. I demand an explanation." His eyes, cold and unreadable behind thick spectacles, narrowed as he regarded me. "Mr. Daniels," he replied evenly, You are accusing respected members of this institution of criminal behavior without incontrovertible proof. These are serious allegations, and I must insist that you refrain from making baseless claims." His dismissal was a final verdict, delivered with the authority of someone who had spent decades suppressing inconvenient truths. That confrontation left me reeling. The official denial, the hostile rebuttal, it was as if every time I tried to expose the darkness, the institution itself conspired to push me further into isolation. My health continued to deteriorate, the stress and the ceaseless interplay of guilt and spectral influence gnawed at my sanity. I began to question whether I was still the rational Daniel who had once taken pride in his meticulous work, or if I had become something else entirely, a vessel for the unresolved sorrows of a past that refused to die. In the solitude of my apartment, as I sat hunched over my desk with the evidence spread out before me, I felt the presence of Evelyn growing ever more insistent. Her spectral form would appear in the corners of my vision, her eyes begging silently for justice, for remembrance. The boundary between my guilt and her lingering spirit had become porous, and I could no longer discern where her anguish ended and my own despair began. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind against the window, seemed to carry her voice, a relentless reminder that I was now intertwined with a legacy of sorrow and injustice. Yet, even as the darkness threatened to consume me, a small ember of determination remained. I knew that exposing the truth was the only path to redemption, not only for Evelyn but for myself and for all those who had been silenced by the hospital's cold indifference. Despite the personal cost, the sleepless nights, the deteriorating health, the creeping fear that I was losing my mind, I steeled myself for the battles ahead. I could no longer remain passive, allowing the threads of guilt to weave themselves into a tapestry of regret that would define my existence. With Lisa and Marcus by my side, I began the painstaking process of collating our evidence into a comprehensive report. We documented every irregularity in the records, every first-hand account of the paranormal disturbances, and every detail that pointed to the deliberate suppression of Evelyn's story. Late nights merged into early mornings as we worked in a frenzy of determination and despair. The physical manifestations became more frequent, the hospital corridors themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of a truth that was desperate to be heard. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my study, I noticed something peculiar. In the reflection of my computer screen, behind my tired eyes, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a faint outline that wasn't my own. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. For a moment, I wondered if my mind, worn thin by guilt and spectral intrusions, was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I sensed that this was yet another sign. Evelyn's spirit, no longer content to remain in the periphery, was now actively merging with my every thought and movement. The merger was terrifying. At times, I would find myself speaking in a tone that wasn't entirely my own, a voice laced with sorrow and regret that I struggled to control. I began to lose hours to daydreams where I was no longer merely Daniel the morgue worker but something else, an unwilling chronicler of a tragedy that spanned lifetimes. In these moments, the line between my identity and the specter of Evelyn blurred until it was nearly impossible to distinguish one from the other. Lisa's gentle admonitions during our nightly calls were laced with worry. "Daniel, please, you need to get help. I'm scared that if you let this continue, you might not come back from it," she pleaded, her voice trembling with both concern and an unspoken recognition that the forces we were dealing with were beyond human reckoning. In the sterile corridors of St. Aurelius, the paranormal disturbances escalated to an almost violent intensity. Objects would be thrown across rooms with a force that defied explanation, and at times, the very walls would reverberate with an unearthly, dissonant hum. I witnessed a colleague nearly stumble backward when a tray of surgical instruments inexplicably flew off a counter, landing with a deafening crash that silenced the room. Every incident, every inexplicable act of violence against the physical world, felt like a manifestation of the hospital's collective guilt, a desperate cry from the depths of its hidden sins. I realized then that the forces we were fighting were not content with being confined to whispered rumors and hidden files. They were demanding acknowledgement, and if we did not act, the consequences might be irreversible. The threads of guilt that bound us, me, Evelyn, and those responsible for her silencing, had now woven themselves into a tapestry that was as dangerous as it was inescapable. With mounting resolve, I vowed that I would not allow my deteriorating health or the spectral forces to silence me. I had to expose the truth, even if it meant facing down the very institution that had nurtured this darkness. The coming days would be fraught with peril and resistance, but I knew that I could no longer hide behind bureaucratic shields and my own fading sanity. The cost of inaction was too great, for Evelyn, for me, and for the countless others whose voices had been smothered by a legacy of injustice. So I steeled myself for the inevitable confrontation with the powers that had long conspired to bury the truth. Even as Lisa's worried calls and Marcus's quiet reassurances underscored the gravity of the situation, I resolved to carry on, driven by the unyielding determination to ensure that the threads of guilt were not lost to the abyss, but instead woven into a final, undeniable reckoning. In that silent, oppressive night, as the rain pounded against my window and the specter of Evelyn lingered just beyond the edge of sight, I sat down at my desk, hands trembling yet resolute, and began to write. Every word, every documented encounter and every painful memory of that fateful night, was a testament to the truth that would no longer be silenced. With each stroke of the pen, I fought back the encroaching darkness, determined to transform guilt into a clarion call for justice, a justice that, even if it came at a great personal cost, would finally set the tortured spirit of Nurse Evelyn free. And so, in the midst of crumbling health and a mind haunted by the merging of two tormented souls, I stepped forward into the uncertain future. I carried with me not only the weight of my own guilt but also the unyielding burden of those who had been wronged. The hospital, with its hidden sins and suppressed secrets, loomed like a specter over us all. But now, the threads of guilt were coming undone, and I was resolved to weave them into a tapestry of truth, no matter how dark the journey might be. I closed my eyes for a moment, summoning the strength to face another day in a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been shattered. In that fragile, trembling silence, I could almost hear Evelyn's soft, desperate whisper mingling with my own heartbeat, "Remember me, remember us," and I knew that, despite the mounting fear and the overwhelming guilt, I could not, and would not, let her voice fade into oblivion. Thus, with each sunrise that promised a new battle against the insidious forces of the past, I vowed to continue the quest for truth. In exposing the layers of corruption, deception, and heartache that had haunted St. Aurelius for decades, I hoped to find redemption not only for Evelyn's shattered soul but for my own, as well. And so, I pressed on, into the heart of darkness, armed with nothing but the fragile strength of conviction and the unwavering belief that even the most buried truths would someday see the light of day. My suspension from St. Aurelius felt like a final, irrevocable severing from the world I once knew. The hospital corridors, the sterile halls I had once patrolled with a sense of order, were now a distant echo, replaced by the oppressive silence of my own apartment. I had become a castaway in a realm of isolation and dread, where every familiar sound, every flicker of light, held the promise of another spectral intrusion. At first, I had welcomed the solitude. Away from the suffocating bureaucracy and the constant confrontation with those who sought to silence the truth, I imagined that retreating into the quiet of my small home would offer respite. Instead, the very walls that I once considered a sanctuary soon became a stage for forces I could neither control nor escape. Night after night, my apartment revealed signs of a presence that was as insistent as it was unyielding. It began subtly. A door left ajar that I was sure I had closed, a misplaced cushion on the sofa, a soft creak in the dead of night that wasn't the settling of an old building. But as days turned to weeks, these minor disturbances escalated into something much more violent. One bitterly cold night, as wind howled against the window panes and rain lashed at the glass, I awoke to the unmistakable sound of furniture shifting in the darkness. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart pounding in my ears, and listened as the gentle rustling of fabric and the dragging of wood echoed through my living room. When I flicked on the bedside lamp, its weak glow revealed long, trembling shadows, but also, in the reflective surface of a nearby mirror, for one harrowing second, the pallid face of a woman with sorrowful eyes. I blinked, and the vision vanished, leaving behind a lingering terror I could neither rationalize nor forget. The manifestations grew more aggressive with each passing night. Doors began slamming shut on their own, objects were inexplicably hurled across rooms. In the stillness, I started to hear a soft, mournful voice that I recognized with a dreadful certainty. It was Evelyn's voice, pleading, desperate. "Remember me. I am still here," it whispered, as if carried on a cold, inexorable wind that seeped through the cracks of my once safe haven. The isolation was absolute. I became a prisoner within my own apartment. I spent long hours hunched over a battered notebook, feverishly documenting every unusual occurrence, the temperature plunges that made my breath visible, the subtle rearrangement of furniture, and the persistent, disembodied sounds that invaded the silence. Every scribbled note was a desperate attempt to cling to the remnants of rationality as the boundary between the living and the dead blurred into a surreal nightmare. In the midst of this personal hell, I turned to Lisa and Marcus, my steadfast allies in the search for truth. Their voices, whether in late-night phone calls or in whispered meetings at a cramped community center, offered solace and the hope of answers. Over cups of weak coffee and in the half-light of flickering overhead bulbs, we pored over our accumulated evidence, searching desperately for a way to safely communicate with the spirit world. Lisa, ever empathetic and nurturing, insisted that we must try to establish a dialogue with Evelyn. "Daniel," she said softly during one of our meetings, "if we can communicate safely, you might finally understand what she needs, and perhaps, that will ease the torment that's consuming you." Marcus, whose normally measured pragmatism had hardened into a steely resolve, added, "There are methods, rituals even, that allow for respectful contact with restless spirits. It's risky, but if it can help us learn the truth, we must try." Reluctantly, I agreed. One stormy night, when the wind battered my apartment and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in from all sides, we arranged a séance. We gathered in the living room, a circle of modest candles arranged in a deliberate pattern on the worn rug. The recorder was placed at the center, a silent witness to the attempt at bridging our world with hers. With trembling voices, we recited our carefully prepared questions. I remember the atmosphere vividly, the palpable weight of expectancy, the stagnant air charged with anticipation and fear. For long minutes, nothing happened. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of the rain and my own ragged breathing. Then, as if the very air had taken on a voice of its own, a soft, mournful whisper emerged from the shadows, "I am here. I have never left." The sound was so clear and sorrowful that I felt the crushing weight of its message in my chest. My recorder picked up faint, indistinct murmurs, and for a brief moment, the temperature in the room plummeted further than ever before. I could see the flicker of candlelight dance wildly on the walls, as if trying to ward off an invisible force. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying. In that moment, I realized that Evelyn was not a passive observer but an active presence, one whose anguish was inextricably linked to the injustice of her untimely demise. Her voice repeated a plea that reverberated in my soul, "Remember me. Tell my story." The intensity of it was overwhelming. It felt as though every ounce of my being was being pulled into her sorrow. But the attempt to communicate did not bring the clarity I had hoped for. Instead, it deepened the isolation and terror that already plagued me. In the days following the séance, I began to experience powerful hallucinations that blurred the lines between memory and nightmare. I saw fleeting images of a younger Evelyn, her eyes bright with determination even as they shimmered with unshed tears, locked in a confrontation with stern faces in the antiseptic corridors of St. Aurelius. In these visions, I was not merely an observer, I felt every moment of her torment as if it were my own. I could almost smell the antiseptic, hear the hushed voices in the background, and feel the weight of injustice that had led to her silencing. The hallucinations became a constant companion, turning my every waking moment into a painful replay of her tragic end. In one particularly vivid vision, I found myself standing in the middle of an empty corridor where the walls pulsed with the echo of forgotten voices. I saw Evelyn lying on a cold floor, her hand reaching out toward me in a silent plea for justice. The image was so visceral that I awoke drenched in sweat, the memory of that cold, hard floor etched into my mind. In those moments, I no longer knew whether I was reliving the past or if the past was invading my present, a merging of realities that left me questioning my grip on sanity. The isolation I had chosen as a refuge now felt like a prison. I became withdrawn, even from those who cared about me. Friends and colleagues noticed my growing detachment. Even Lisa's gentle calls became tinged with a sorrowful urgency as she pleaded for me to seek help. "Daniel, you're losing yourself in this darkness," she said one evening, her voice cracking with emotion over the phone. "I'm scared for you. I know you're determined to uncover the truth, but you must not let her pain become your own." But how could I separate the guilt that I felt for her forgotten tragedy from the guilt that was consuming me? Every moment of solitude, every uncontrollable hallucination, was a reminder of the injustice that had bound us together. Lisa and Marcus did not relent in their search for a way to mediate this merging of spirits and self. They dove into research with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Lisa spent hours poring over ancient texts and modern treatises on paranormal communication, determined to find a ritual or a method that could safely channel Evelyn's voice without further endangering my fragile psyche. Marcus, ever the meticulous documentarian, reached out to local experts in spectral phenomena and scoured forgotten archives for references to similar cases. Their combined efforts were a lifeline, each new piece of information a small beacon of hope in a sea of despair. In one of our many late-night sessions, Lisa and I sat together in my living room, papers and books strewn about like a chaotic tapestry of desperation. "Daniel," she said, her eyes soft with worry, "you must understand that you are not alone in this. Evelyn's spirit is reaching out for justice, yes, but she also needs you to remain yourself. We need to find a way to help you regain control over your own mind." I nodded silently, the weight of her words mingling with the heaviness of my own internal torment. I could only muster a hoarse whisper in reply, I just can't bear this isolation any longer. Every corner of my home, every shadow, seems to carry her pain, and it's beginning to feel like I'm becoming her." Her hand reached out and squeezed mine gently, a silent promise that she would not let me succumb to the darkness. Yet, even as I clung to her reassurance, I could feel the relentless encroachment of fear tightening its grip on my soul. The spectral manifestations were no longer confined to isolated episodes, they had become a permanent, invasive presence that seeped into every facet of my existence. The nights were the worst, hours stretched endlessly as I lay in bed, the silence broken by the soft, desperate murmurs of a voice that demanded to be heard. "Remember me. Remember us," it pleaded repeatedly, until it was as though the words were engraved into the very air around me. During one such night, as I sat in the darkness with only the faint glow of a street lamp outside to keep the shadows at bay, I was overcome by an almost tangible wave of despair. In that moment, the isolation felt unbearable, not just the physical solitude, but a deep, existential loneliness that threatened to drown out any hope of redemption. I felt as though I were suspended between two worlds, caught in a vortex of guilt and spectral anguish. In a moment of overwhelming clarity, I realized that the only way to break free from this torment was to allow Evelyn's tragic story to emerge from the darkness. Her explicit plea for justice was not meant to merge with my identity and consume it. It was a call to action, a demand that her voice be heard so that the injustice that had defined her life might finally be acknowledged. That realization, however, did little to alleviate the pervasive fear that had become my constant companion. In the weeks that followed, I continued to experience hallucinations so vivid that reality itself began to warp around me. There were mornings when I would wake from dreams that left me gasping for air, the images of Evelyn's final moments etched into my memory with an almost physical pain. At times, I found myself standing in the hallway of my apartment, certain that I saw her figure reflected in the glass of a darkened window. At others, I could swear that her voice was echoing through the very walls, a mournful sound that defied the passage of time. The isolation that I had once thought might offer a temporary refuge had become an inescapable prison, a place where fear and loneliness conspired to obliterate the last vestiges of my former self. Each day, I battled the encroaching shadows and the ceaseless whisper of a spirit whose only desire was to be remembered. And yet, even in the midst of this overwhelming terror, a fragile determination took root. I resolved that I would not let the merging of our souls, my own guilt intertwined with her sorrow, be the end of me. Instead, I would use this profound connection as a catalyst for change, a way to honor Evelyn's memory and expose the injustices that had silenced her. I began to compile my experiences into a detailed journal, every entry a testament to the horrors and the revelations of these long, agonizing months. In each entry, I recorded the vivid hallucinations, the unexplained sounds, and the moments when Evelyn's voice broke through the veil of silence with an unmistakable clarity. I wrote of nights when the air was so thick with her presence that I could feel her despair pressing against my skin, and of mornings when I awoke with tears streaming down my face as I remembered her tragic end. Every word was imbued with the raw, unfiltered emotion of a man caught between two worlds, desperate to find meaning in the midst of isolation and fear. Now, as I sit and reflect on these tumultuous days, I realize that the terror I've experienced is not simply a punishment for daring to seek the truth, it is the echo of a deeper injustice. Evelyn's voice, her anguished plea for recognition and accountability, is a call that transcends the boundaries of life and death. It is a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, will always resurface unless confronted and acknowledged. In the solitude of my apartment, this once hallowed refuge turned prison, I find that my isolation is both a curse and a crucible. It has forced me to confront the most uncomfortable truths about myself and about the world that allowed such injustice to flourish. Though the weight of fear and guilt presses down on me with crushing force, it is also in this crucible that I have found a spark of resolve. I am determined to use this painful isolation to galvanize my efforts, to ensure that Evelyn's story is not lost to the silence of indifference. Lisa and Marcus continue their tireless research, seeking out new methods of communication and new insights into the paranormal forces that have invaded my life. Their unwavering support is a beacon in the oppressive darkness, a reminder that even in the depths of isolation, I am not entirely alone. Yet, every day, as I struggle against the merging of her sorrow with my own, I am reminded that I stand at a crossroads, a fragile point where the past and present collide, where the voice of a wronged soul demands not just remembrance, but action. I know now that I must not let the fear that has accompanied these nights of isolation dictate the course of my life. Evelyn's plea, clear and unyielding, echoes in every corner of my mind. Remember me. Tell my story. Let justice be done. And so, I have resolved to fight not only for her memory but for the truth that lies hidden behind layers of institutional neglect and human indifference. In doing so, I hope to shatter the silence that has allowed this injustice to persist for far too long. As I close this chapter of isolation and fear, I do so with a cautious hope, a determination forged in the crucible of relentless torment and profound loneliness. The path ahead is shrouded in darkness, and the specter of Evelyn remains an ever-present companion. Yet I have come to understand that it is within this darkness that the seeds of change can be sown. I will continue to document every spectral whisper, every heart-wrenching hallucination, and every moment of dread until the truth is fully revealed. With each new sunrise, I carry with me the weight of her explicit plea and the promise that one day, through our combined efforts, justice will prevail. I refuse to let isolation and fear become my undoing. Instead, I will transform them into the driving force behind a final reckoning, a reckoning that will shake the foundations of St. Aurelia's and ensure that the voices of the silenced are never again allowed to fade into oblivion. I step forward into the uncertain future, haunted yet unbroken, determined to honor Evelyn's memory by speaking her truth. And as the darkness deepens, I cling to that fragile hope, whispering to the silent shadows, I remember you, Evelyn. I will not let your story be lost. I will speak for you, and I will see that justice is done. Thus, with trembling resolve and a heart heavy with both grief and newfound determination, I embrace this lonely path, knowing that every step forward is a step toward redemption, a step toward ensuring that the past, no matter how dark, is never allowed to remain forgotten. The hospital's secrets had already infiltrated every corner of my existence. But nothing could have prepared me for the cold, suffocating dread that clung to the long-abandoned wing of St. Aurelia's, a wing so neglected that it seemed to exist only in whispered legends and forgotten maintenance logs. When Lisa and Marcus first broached the idea of investigating this forsaken section, I hesitated. My mind, already teetering under the weight of spectral visitations and relentless guilt, recoiled at the thought of venturing into a place where the very air felt tainted with sorrow and malice. Yet the lure of undiscovered clues, a final piece of Evelyn's tragic narrative, was too potent to resist. It was a moonless night when we gathered our gear and set off. The hospital's modern corridors faded behind us as we navigated a labyrinth of service passages and dim stairwells. The forgotten wing lay beyond a rusted door obscured by layers of dust and cobwebs, as if nature itself had conspired to erase its existence. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with peeling, faded wallpaper and the scent of decay. The temperature plummeted the moment we stepped inside, and every step echoed like a funeral dirge in that silent, forsaken space. Our flashlights carved shaky beams through the oppressive darkness, revealing remnants of a bygone era, abandoned stretchers, overturned chairs, and filing cabinets left to rust in the corners. The atmosphere was heavy with the unmistakable residue of sorrow and neglect, as though the very walls remembered the anguish of those who had once walked these corridors. I could feel the pull of a presence even before I saw it, an almost tangible force urging me deeper into the wing. "Do you feel that?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling slightly. His eyes darted around, trying to catch a glimpse of something moving in the periphery of the light. Lisa gripped my arm, her expression a mixture of determination and dread. We moved slowly, each step measured against the overwhelming sense of foreboding that clung to every surface. It wasn't long before we encountered our first overt sign of the supernatural. In a small, abandoned office, a rusted filing cabinet lay open as if hastily rifled through. Papers fluttered in a draft that we couldn't feel, and I noticed that among the documents was a set of handwritten notes. The ink, though faded, was unmistakable, a hurried scrawl that recounted details of an incident involving a nurse whose name I recognized instantly. Evelyn. The notes hinted at mistreatment, a deliberate silencing, and a desperate plea for acknowledgement. My heart pounded as I scanned the page, each word reinforcing the deep injustice that had been perpetrated against her. But as we delved deeper into the wing, the paranormal manifestations grew bolder and more violent. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic, elongating, twisting, and merging with the darkness like living things. The sound of footsteps echoed down empty corridors, sometimes matching our own, sometimes coming from behind us when we turned our flashlights away. At one point, Lisa stifled a gasp when a door slammed shut several feet away, its reverberation a deafening punctuation in the silence. I tried to steady my racing heart, reminding myself that every anomaly was evidence, every unexplained occurrence a thread leading back to Evelyn's tragic past. Our progress was suddenly halted in a narrow passageway where the temperature dropped so dramatically that our breath hung visibly in the air. I felt a presence so intense it nearly pinned me to the spot, a presence that felt equal parts sorrow and fury. For a moment, I thought I saw the unmistakable silhouette of a woman, her form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. Her eyes, though blurred, burned with a desperate intensity that spoke of pain and betrayal. I wanted to reach out, to ask her what she needed, but before I could move, the figure dissolved into the oppressive gloom, leaving behind only an echo of her despair. "Daniel," Marcus said, his voice a low murmur, "I think she's here. I feel her, too. It's like she's trying to guide us." His words sent a shiver down my spine as I realized that this wing was not merely a repository of old records, it was a living mausoleum of secrets, a place where the past and the present collided in an endless cycle of anguish. I recalled the spectral apparitions in the morgue and the anguished pleas that had haunted my apartment. Now, in this forgotten wing, Evelyn's presence was unmistakable and raw, her sorrow almost palpable in the stale air. As we pressed on, we discovered more evidence that shattered the final remnants of the official narrative. Hidden behind a loose panel in one of the storage closets was a small, dust-covered safe. Marcus's deft fingers worked the combination lock, numbers gleaned from scraps of documents and whispered legends, and with a creak, the safe swung open to reveal a trove of long-forgotten files. Among them were personal letters, diaries, and internal memos that chronicled a time when Evelyn had fought tirelessly against the injustice inflicted upon her and the other staff. The documents detailed not only her unheeded pleas but also hints of collusion among the higher-ups, a calculated effort to erase dissent and maintain an oppressive order. The evidence was overwhelming, each page a testament to a suffering that had been deliberately concealed. I felt a surge of anger and pity all at once, anger at the callousness of those who had silenced her, and pity for a soul trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. But the deeper we ventured, the more the wing itself seemed to rebel against our intrusion. A series of corridors twisted in disorienting loops, and the sense of time became muddled. At one point, we found ourselves inexplicably back in a room we had passed through minutes before, a dusty storage area with a single, broken window letting in a sliver of moonlight. The air here was heavy with a malignant force, and I felt as if invisible hands were trying to clutch at my shoulders. In a moment of terror and determination, I grabbed Marcus's arm and shouted, "We need to leave now." But before we could retrace our steps, the corridor ahead collapsed into darkness, and an unseen barrier seemed to push us further inside, trapping us within the wing's decaying heart. Panic set in as we realized that we were not alone in our entrapment. The oppressive darkness was punctuated by the sound of distant wailing, a mournful cry that resonated deep within our bones. Lisa clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror as she whispered, "Daniel, it's her. Evelyn's spirit, it's angry now." The voice of the lost nurse, so often a soft whisper in quieter moments, now roared through the halls like a tempest, each cry an accusation of neglect and cruelty. The sound reverberated through our chests, shaking us to our core, and I felt my own resolve waver under the weight of the overwhelming sorrow and rage. In that claustrophobic moment, as we were forced into a tight cluster against a crumbling wall, I realized that confronting our fears was no longer optional, it was inevitable. The spectral manifestations intensified, and I was plunged into a visceral confrontation with my own inner demons. In the suffocating dark, I felt the force of Evelyn's anguish as if it were a tangible entity pressing against me. Images flashed through my mind, a younger Evelyn, determined and compassionate, standing defiant against the cruelty of an uncaring system, her gradual descent into despair as her pleas went unanswered, and her final moments, a cascade of desperate protests that were silenced by those in power. The memories of her lost voice flooded me, mingling with my own guilt and sorrow. As I confronted these visions, the oppressive atmosphere began to shift. The malevolence in the wing seemed to recede slightly, replaced by a strange, almost sacred stillness. It was as though Evelyn herself was guiding us through the darkness, urging us to understand the full extent of the tragedy that had been hidden away. In a moment of raw clarity, I called out softly, "Evelyn. I'm here. I want to know your truth." My voice, choked with emotion, echoed off the decaying walls, and for a long heartbeat, nothing answered except the soft, plaintive sigh of the building itself. Then, as if in response, the spectral manifestations coalesced around me. The oppressive gloom parted like a curtain to reveal a vision so vivid that it defied description. In the center of the dilapidated corridor stood Evelyn, not as a vague apparition, but as a fully realized presence. Her eyes shone with unshed tears and a fierce determination, and her expression was one of profound sorrow and a desperate need for absolution. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her every step radiating both pain and an almost palpable longing for justice. In that moment, time seemed to slow to a crawl as I stood transfixed, feeling every emotion that she conveyed without uttering a single word. Her eyes locked with mine, and I felt as though she were reaching out to communicate all the unsaid words of decades past, the betrayals, the unheeded warnings, and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would finally remember her story. The spectral vision was accompanied by flashes of memory, the sterile corridors of the hospital, hushed confrontations in shadowed offices, and the final moments of a life cut tragically short by cruelty and silence. It was as though the forgotten wing itself had become a repository for all the pain and injustice that had been systematically swept aside. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, caught between terror and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. In that quiet confrontation, I realized that Evelyn's desperate plea was not meant to break me, but to guide me, to give me the strength to complete what I had started. The truth of her story, so long buried under layers of indifference and corruption, needed to be set free. And I, despite my own fractures and fears, had been chosen as the vessel through which that truth could be spoken. As the vision of Evelyn began to fade, replaced by the oppressive, familiar darkness of the abandoned wing, I felt a renewed determination surge through me. The door to the forgotten wing remained open, a gateway not only to the past but to the future of justice. Lisa and Marcus, still huddled at my side, exchanged looks of both relief and lingering terror. They had witnessed the same undeniable truth, that within these decaying walls lay the story of a nurse whose voice had been stifled for far too long. We emerged from the forgotten wing that night transformed. Every step back through the corridors of the living hospital was heavy with the knowledge of what we had uncovered. The evidence we had gathered, files, personal letters, and the indelible imprint of a spectral plea, was a promise that the truth could no longer be contained in the shadows. Yet, as we retraced our steps, a final, lingering question haunted me. Would exposing this dark legacy finally bring peace to Evelyn's tormented soul, or would it unleash consequences that none of us were prepared to face? In the cold light of the early morning, as we finally stepped out into the sterile brightness of the hospital's main corridors, I carried with me a newfound resolve and an unshakable certainty that the journey was far from over. The forgotten wing had revealed the hidden scars of Saint Aurelius, scars that demanded not only remembrance but reckoning. And as I looked back one last time at the rusted door behind which so many lost voices resided, I silently vowed that I would continue the fight. I would honor Evelyn's memory by ensuring that every thread of guilt and every suppressed secret was brought into the light. For in that night of spectral revelations and soul-wrenching isolation, I had seen the true face of injustice, a face that had haunted not just the abandoned wing, but every corner of my existence. And with the echoes of Evelyn's plea still reverberating in my heart, I stepped forward into the uncertain future, prepared to carry the torch of truth into the deepest darkness, no matter the cost. The day had finally come when the secrets that had festered in the dark corners of Saint Aurelius could no longer be contained behind closed doors. I had spent months gathering damning evidence, files hidden away in the forgotten wing, personal letters detailing Evelyn's final moments, and testimonies from those who had been too frightened to speak out. Every piece of the puzzle had led to this inevitable reckoning. Now, I was determined to expose the truth, not just to the administration but to the world. It began with an invitation I received from a local investigative news outlet, a modest but dedicated group known for unearthing corruption in public institutions. They had heard murmurs of my research and the disturbing anomalies that plagued the hospital. I agreed to meet with them, and in the sterile conference room of a downtown building, I presented my dossier, a collection of records, personal testimonies, and even audio clips that captured the sorrowful murmurings of Evelyn's ghost. I laid bare the injustice, the deliberate cover-up of a nurse's untimely death, the erasure of her identity, and the pervasive culture of silence that allowed those responsible to continue their unchecked authority. The news report aired to a modest audience at first, but it soon spread through local media channels like wildfire. As the revelations gained traction, a storm of public outrage began to build. Parents, former patients, and even a few brave hospital staff members stepped forward, demanding accountability. For the first time in decades, the administration of Saint Aurelius found itself under the relentless glare of public scrutiny. Within days, the hospital was forced to convene an emergency board meeting. The walls of that conference room, once echoing with the quiet routine of administrative business, now vibrated with tension. I was called to speak, a lone voice among a sea of skeptical officials, whose expressions ranged from guarded defensiveness to thinly veiled remorse. I stood at the head of a long, polished table, my evidence spread out before me like a map of the institution's hidden sins. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing in the cavernous room, "I come before you not as an accuser seeking retribution but as someone who has borne witness to an injustice that has haunted this institution for far too long. Nurse Evelyn was more than just a statistic in a forgotten file. She was a person, compassionate soul whose life was cut short by those who cared more for maintaining appearances than for seeking the truth." I recounted the events, the strange markings on the morgue paperwork, the inexplicable movements of objects, the spectral apparitions that had haunted my nights. I described the long-forgotten wing, where every dusty file and every whispered memory testified to the cover-up. I spoke of the internal memos and redacted documents that revealed a conspiracy to bury the truth, all while the living suffered under the weight of guilt and silence. As I spoke, I could see the lines on the faces of the board members beginning to soften, the icy reserve thawing into something resembling regret. A senior administrator, eyes downcast and voice heavy with remorse, finally broke his silence. "Mr. Daniels, we had no idea that the truth would come out in such a manner," he said haltingly. "Our procedures, our priorities, they were flawed. We have failed in not only Nurse Evelyn but every person who trusted this institution." That public admission, tentative as it was, marked the beginning of the hospital's long overdue reckoning. Within weeks, a formal investigation was launched by an independent body. Dr. Aldrich and his cohorts were summoned to testify, and the records that had once been hidden away were finally made accessible. The evidence could no longer be disputed. There was a trail of negligence, intentional suppression, and even acts that bordered on criminal indifference. Even as the institution grappled with its own culpability, I found that the haunting presence of Evelyn grew ever more insistent. It was as though the more that the truth emerged into the light, the more her spirit demanded personal acknowledgement. Every time I passed through the halls of the morgue, now the epicenter of the scandal, there was a moment when the temperature would drop, when I would sense a figure standing silently in the corner. Her face, blurred yet unmistakably sorrowful, would appear in the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights. I began to understand that this was not merely a manifestation of regret or an expression of lingering anguish, it was a call for an apology, a plea for reconciliation. In the weeks that followed the public exposé, I took it upon myself to organize a symbolic memorial for Nurse Evelyn. With the support of several compassionate staff members who had come forward with their own painful stories, I arranged a small, quiet service in the hospital's central atrium. The room was set with a simple display, a single, worn photograph of Evelyn in her nurse's uniform, a bouquet of wildflowers, and a handwritten note that read, "In memory of those silenced, may your voices guide us to the truth." A modest crowd gathered that day, staff, former patients, and members of the community who had long sensed that something was amiss. As I stood before them, I offered a heartfelt apology on behalf of the institution and of myself. "I am deeply sorry," I said, my voice cracking with emotion, "for the pain that Nurse Evelyn endured, for the injustice that allowed her story to be forgotten. We have a duty to remember, to learn, and to ensure that no one's voice is ever lost in the silence of indifference again." My words were met with a heavy, collective silence, punctuated by the occasional soft sniffle. For a long moment, I felt as if I were standing on the edge of a vast, emotional chasm, a gap between the past and a future that was now irrevocably altered by the truth. That very evening, compelled by a mixture of dread and determination, I returned to the morgue, the heart of the institution's haunted legacy. The cold, sterile space, which had once been a sanctuary of order, now resonated with a deeper, almost sacred melancholy. I felt drawn to the table where, night after night, I had witnessed inexplicable phenomena. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. As I stood alone, I could sense that I was not truly alone. The lights flickered, and in the near total darkness, she appeared again. Evelyn's spectral figure, more vivid and tangible than ever before, drifted toward me. This time, there was no hesitation, no fleeting moment of uncertainty. Her eyes, shimmering with sorrow and a kind of resigned forgiveness, locked onto mine. In that charged moment, I felt every ounce of my guilt and sorrow boil over into a deep, anguished understanding. I fell to my knees, overcome by the weight of what I owed her, and what we all owed her. "Evelyn," I whispered hoarsely, tears streaming down my face, "I'm so sorry. I see your pain, I see your suffering, and I cannot change what was done. But I promise you, I will do everything in my power to make this right. Your truth will not be silenced any longer." My voice, raw and trembling, echoed through the stillness of the morgue, mingling with the quiet hum of the refrigeration units. For what felt like an eternity, I knelt there in supplication, my apology a fragile offering in the face of decades of injustice. And then, as if in response, the spectral form of Evelyn moved closer. In a moment of transcendent clarity, her ghostly face softened, and for the first time, I sensed a glimmer of peace in her tortured eyes. It was as if she had finally received the acknowledgement she so desperately needed, a quiet, unspoken forgiveness that resonated deep within me. I rose slowly, my body trembling not only from exhaustion but also from the profound catharsis of that encounter. I knew that this was not the end of my journey, but rather the beginning of a long path toward healing, for myself, for the institution, and most importantly, for the spirit of Nurse Evelyn. The public reckoning with the truth had forced the hand of those in power, and though the road ahead was fraught with difficult changes, it was a necessary step toward redemption. In the days and weeks that followed, the hospital implemented sweeping reforms. New protocols were introduced to ensure transparency and accountability, and a permanent memorial for Nurse Evelyn was established within the hospital, a quiet garden in the back courtyard where the light of remembrance shone softly on a plaque bearing her name and the words, "In memory of a guardian of truth." I visited that garden often, finding solace in the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of a fountain. There, surrounded by the living and the echoes of the past, I could almost feel her presence, no longer as a tormented spirit, but as a quiet sentinel watching over us all. Yet, even as the administration took tentative steps toward atonement, I understood that the scars of the past would remain. The truth, once buried in the shadows, had been forced into the light, and with it came the heavy burden of remembrance. I continued to document my journey, every spectral encounter and every shred of evidence, as a testament to the power of acknowledging the silenced voices of the past. I knew that my struggle was not just about seeking justice for one lost soul, it was about ensuring that the lessons of history were never forgotten, that the vulnerable were always heard, and that the institutions we trust with our lives were held accountable for their actions. Standing now in the glow of a new day, I reflect on the turbulent journey that brought me here. The hospital, once a place of sterile routine and hidden cruelty, had become a battleground for truth, a place where the ghosts of injustice were finally given a voice. And in that transformation, I found a measure of redemption for myself, too. I had learned that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to confront the darkness head-on, to expose the hidden sins of the past, and to extend an earnest apology in the hope of healing old wounds. Evelyn's voice still echoes in the quiet moments. The soft murmur that once haunted my dreams has now become a gentle reminder of the cost of silence. Her spectral presence, once a harbinger of terror, now seems to linger in a space of somber grace, a spirit no longer bound by unspoken guilt but freed by the acknowledgement of her truth. In the sacred silence of the morgue and the tranquil beauty of the memorial garden, I hear her soft, tender plea, "Remember me, and let my story guide you." I carry that plea with me as I continue my work, both as a humble custodian of the dead and as a relentless seeker of truth. The journey is far from over, and the shadows of the past will always remain a part of who I am. But I have learned that by facing the darkness and speaking the truth, even the most hidden wounds can begin to heal. And so, with a heart heavy with remembrance yet buoyed by a newfound resolve, I step forward into the uncertain future, determined to ensure that no voice, no matter how long it has been silenced, ever fades into oblivion again. In that final act of reconciliation, as I whispered my heartfelt apology to the silent walls of the morgue and the unseen spirit that had haunted me for so long, I understood that the truth and the reckoning were inseparable. The past, with all its hidden scars and whispered regrets, would forever be a part of us. But in acknowledging it openly, in seeking forgiveness and embracing accountability, we might just find a path toward redemption, a path lit by the memory of those who were once lost, now given the voice they so desperately deserved. The day of the memorial had passed, but its reverberations continued to echo through the corridors of St. Aurelia's long after the ceremony ended. In the aftermath, the palpable weight of sorrow seemed to lift, if only slightly, as if the very act of remembrance had quieted the storm. For a few fragile days, the paranormal disturbances subsided, replaced by an eerie calm that both soothed and unsettled me. I returned to work with a cautious optimism, a tentative hope that normalcy might finally be restored. Yet, even in that calm, I could feel the lingering presence of shadows that refused to be entirely exorcised. Every morning, as I walked through the now transformed halls, I noticed the changes. New protocols were in place, and the air was filled with hushed conversations about reform and accountability. The hospital's leadership had initiated sweeping changes, their faces now marred by an unspoken regret. A permanent memorial for Nurse Evelyn stood in the back courtyard, a modest garden where wildflowers danced in the gentle breeze, and a plaque bore her name, accompanied by the inscription, "In memory of a guardian of truth." The display was both a tribute and a promise that her story would never again be buried in silence. Yet, as I went about my duties in the morgue, a place that had become both my sanctuary and my torment, I felt that something was still amiss. The once cold, clinical routine now held an undercurrent of mystery. I would often catch a glimpse of something moving at the edge of my vision, a gentle shimmer of light or the soft outline of a figure that vanished before I could be sure of what I saw. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the hospital's fluorescent lights hummed in a monotonous vigil, I sometimes sensed a presence by my side. It was never intrusive or malevolent, but rather a subtle reminder that the past had not yet released its grip. Lisa and Marcus remained my steadfast companions throughout this turbulent journey. They, too, continued to ponder the unresolved mysteries of mortality and the injustice that had defined our struggle. We met frequently, sometimes in the hospital's break room over lukewarm coffee, other times in the quiet corners of local libraries, or even at my apartment where the ghosts of my sleepless nights still lingered. In those conversations, our voices would sometimes falter, weighed down by memories of what had been uncovered and by the knowledge that there were still many questions left unanswered. "Daniel," Lisa said one rainy afternoon as we reviewed yet another set of old records, "there's a part of me that wonders if we've truly laid all these shadows to rest. Or if, somehow, by unearthing these secrets, we've only deepened the darkness." Her eyes, warm yet haunted, searched mine for reassurance that I shared her uncertainty. I had no answer to offer, only a heavy silence that conveyed the truth. Some wounds, once inflicted, leave scars that never fully heal. Marcus, ever the practical one, attempted to reassure us. "We've made progress," he reminded us. "The hospital is changing, and public attention is demanding transparency." But I agree with Lisa, the past is a persistent ghost. It has a way of lingering, of reminding us that even when the truth is acknowledged, the pain remains. His tone was resigned, as though he had long ago accepted that some shadows are eternal companions. In the weeks that followed, as the hospital slowly began to function in its new guise of reformed administration and cautious openness, I attempted to reclaim a semblance of normalcy in my personal life. Yet, no matter how diligently I tried to bury the memories of spectral apparitions and the weight of guilt, I could not escape the feeling that I was forever changed. At times, I'd sit in quiet contemplation by the memorial garden, feeling both comforted and disturbed by the soft murmur of the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. The garden was a living reminder that some spirits, though no longer tormented by fury, continued to hover on the boundaries of our world. One autumn evening, as twilight crept over the hospital and the chill of approaching winter seeped into every stone and corridor, I found myself alone in the morgue once more. The familiar hum of the refrigeration units provided a somnolent counterpoint to the silence. I was reviewing the new records when, out of the corner of my eye, I sensed a presence. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a stray reflection or a trick of the light. Instead, I caught a glimpse of a pale face, soft and indistinct, lingering in the darkness behind a row of drawers. It was Evelyn, her expression gentle, as though she had finally found a measure of peace, yet her eyes held a quiet uncertainty. For a long moment, I stood transfixed, my heart swelling with an amalgam of relief and lingering sorrow. Was this a final farewell, a gentle acknowledgement that her spirit had at last found rest? Or was it the reminder of a debt that remained unfulfilled, a debt that bound my soul to the echoes of her pain? The figure shimmered briefly and then faded into the dark recesses of the room, leaving me with a silent, aching question. That night, as I lay awake in bed, the events of the past months swirled in my thoughts like a tempest. I recalled the spectral apparitions, the relentless investigations, the hallways of the forgotten wing, and the day of reckoning that had forever altered the institution I had once served. I had fought to bring the truth to light, to honor Evelyn's memory with a public apology and a memorial that promised accountability and change. And yet, despite these strides, a part of me felt that the shadows were unending, that the darkness was not something that could simply be vanquished by exposure and reform. In the ensuing days, whispers among the staff hinted that, although the outward signs of unrest had subsided, there remained a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere. Some claimed that the hospital corridors now felt warmer, more compassionate, others swore that they still heard soft, indistinct voices in the dead of night. Conversations in hushed tones revolved around the possibility that while the institution had begun to heal, the scars of its past would always be etched into its very foundation. I began to accept that this duality, this coexistence of progress and persistent mystery, was perhaps inevitable. The past, with its unspeakable truths and long-buried injustices, had shaped the present in ways that could not be undone. Like a dark mirror, it reflected back on us our own vulnerabilities, our capacity for both cruelty and redemption. And even as the new protocols and public scrutiny promised a better future, I knew deep down that some shadows were destined to linger, haunting the quiet corners of our existence. One chilly evening, as I strolled along the hospital's perimeter under a sky heavy with starless darkness, I paused by the memorial garden. The wildflowers swayed gently, and the plaque for Nurse Evelyn glinted faintly in the sparse light. I placed my hand on the cool surface of the stone, feeling an almost imperceptible vibration beneath my fingertips, a reminder that the past was not dead, but rather an ever-present pulse beneath the surface of our lives. In that moment, a thought surfaced that both comforted and unsettled me. Perhaps Evelyn's spirit was not solely a remnant of tragedy, but also a guide, a gentle force urging us to remember that justice is a process, not a single moment of resolution. The soft murmur of the wind seemed to echo that sentiment, carrying with it a message that was as elusive as it was profound, that the journey toward healing and truth was unending, a constant interplay between light and shadow. Returning to my apartment that night, I found that the silence was not as oppressive as before. Instead, it was filled with a strange, reflective calm, a silence that allowed me to listen to the quieter, more subtle echoes of the world around me. I sat by the window, watching as the city lights twinkled in the distance, each one a tiny beacon in a vast, dark expanse. In the stillness, I heard the softest whisper, a gentle murmur that, for an instant, resembled a familiar cadence. Remember me. It was not the anguished plea of the past, but a soft, almost tender reminder that some connections persist beyond the boundaries of time and sorrow. In that final, ambiguous moment, I realized that the reconciliation we sought was not a neat, complete restoration of order. Rather, it was an uneasy balance, a fragile coexistence between what we choose to confront and what remains hidden. The hospital's transformation, the reforms and memorials, all served as markers along a winding road that stretched into an uncertain future. Yet even as we moved forward, I knew that a part of me, and perhaps a part of all of us, would always be drawn to those lingering mysteries. And so, as I prepared for another day among colleagues whose eyes now carried both hope and guarded suspicion, I embraced the uneasy truth that the shadows are, in many ways, unending. They are not merely remnants of past sins or forgotten grief. They are an integral part of our existence, whispering to us in the quiet moments, urging us to never become complacent, to always seek understanding and compassion in the face of injustice. I stepped into the bustling hallways of St. Aurelia's, feeling the faint touch of a spectral hand on my shoulder, a delicate caress that might have been the echo of Evelyn's farewell or perhaps the simple brush of memory. I could not say for certain. What I did know was that the truth, with all its painful beauty and haunting complexity, had changed us all. The past had been unveiled, and though some wounds might never fully heal, the act of remembering had set us on a course toward redemption. As the days passed, the balance between light and darkness remained fragile, a testament to the impermanence of resolution. The hospital, now a symbol of both sorrow and reform, stood as a reminder that while the specters of injustice may fade from sight, they never truly disappear. They live on in our hearts and in the quiet spaces between our thoughts, a silent, unsettling reminder that the shadows of the past are ever present, shaping our future in ways both subtle and profound. Tonight, as I sit alone in my modest living room, the soft glow of the television a distant murmur against the vast silence of the night, I can still sense her presence. In the corner of my eye, I glimpse a gentle flicker, a delicate interplay of light and shadow that suggests she might still be there, watching, waiting. I do not know if Evelyn's spirit has finally found peace or if the darkness that envelopes her memory will continue to linger like an unanswered question. Perhaps the truth is that some mysteries are meant to remain, eternally poised between remembrance and oblivion. In that unsettling twilight, I lean back in my chair and allow the quiet to envelop me. The air is thick with unspoken words and unresolved questions, and somewhere, deep within the recesses of my mind, the soft echo of her voice whispers one last time, "Remember me," whether it is a call for forgiveness, a plea for justice, or a bittersweet farewell, I cannot tell. But I know that the story is not over. The shadows are unending, and in their restless dance, they invite us to keep questioning, to keep searching, and to never let the truth slip silently into darkness. And so, as the night deepens and the silence grows, I remain, a solitary witness to a truth that is both liberating and haunting. In this delicate balance of light and shadow, of memory and mystery, I find that the journey toward understanding is itself a path lined with unanswered questions. The story of Nurse Evelyn, and all those who have been lost to indifference, continues to shape our lives in subtle, profound ways. As I finally close my eyes, I am left with a final, lingering thought, a testament to the enduring power of memory in the ceaseless whisper of the past, that while the darkness may recede with the dawn, its echoes will forever resonate, inviting us to remember, to question, and to be ever vigilant in our pursuit of truth. In that ambiguous, unsettling silence, I wonder, has peace ever truly come for Evelyn, or do her shadows, like those that now linger at the edge of my vision, ensure that her story, and our own, will remain a perpetual, haunting enigma? The answer, perhaps, lies not in certainty but in the very act of remembering. And so, the night stretches on, an eternal canvas upon which the faintest whispers of the past continue to be painted, a quiet, unsettling reminder that some shadows are unending, and that in the depths of every memory, there lies a truth waiting to be revealed.